The pre-war world, economic stability, and gold. Good evening. As we settle into our discussion, let's gently transition from our broader overview of economic thought to a specific moment, a crucial juncture where competing visions began to sharpen. We turn our attention to the pre-war world, a period seemingly defined by economic stability and deeply intertwined with the allure of gold. Imagine, if you will, a world underpinned by the gold standard. This wasn't simply an economic arrangement. It was a philosophy. Gold, in its perceived immutability, its inherent scarcity, represented a natural order. Currencies were tethered to its value, creating a system of fixed exchange rates. International trade flowed, seemingly frictionless, guided by the invisible hand of supply and demand. The prevailing wisdom, espoused by the classical economist, held that markets, left largely to their own devices, would tend towards equilibrium. Any deviations, temporary imbalances, would be self-correcting. The beauty of the gold standard, proponents argued, lay in its inherent discipline. Governments, constrained by the need to maintain gold reserves, were discouraged from excessive spending or inflationary monetary policies. Fiscal responsibility was not a matter of choice, but a consequence of the system itself. The market, a vast and complex organism, possessed an inherent wisdom far exceeding that of any individual or institution. It was a system of checks and balances, not centrally planned, but organically evolved. Think of it as a slowly turning flywheel, resisting sudden acceleration or deceleration, smoothing the ride through economic fluctuations. However, beneath this veneer of stability, fault lines were beginning to appear. The very rigidity of the gold standard, its inflexibility in the face of unforeseen shocks, would prove to be its undoing. Crises, of course, were not unknown, but the tools available to the policymaker to manage these crises were severely limited. With currencies fixed to gold, devaluation, a common recourse in modern economies, was simply not an option. Interest rates, too, were constrained by the need to maintain convertibility. The system, designed for stability, could, paradoxically, amplify instability. It was in this context that the seeds of dissent were sown, that competing visions of stabilization in markets began to take root. The prevailing narrative, one of laissez-faire and self-correcting mechanisms, was increasingly challenged by those who believed in a more active role for government in managing the economy. The idea that markets, left to their own devices, could lead to prolonged periods of unemployment and economic stagnation was beginning to gain traction. Imagine a stream, its natural flow impeded by a dam. Left unattended, the water would pool, stagnate. The intervention of an engineer, a conscious act of management, was needed to restore the flow. This nascent challenge to the established order would soon coalesce into a distinct counter-narrative, a framework for understanding the economy that placed greater emphasis on aggregate demand and the role of government spending in stimulating economic activity. This alternative perspective acknowledged the inherent imperfections of markets, the potential for imbalances to persist, and the need for deliberate intervention to steer the economy towards full employment. It was a departure from the classical orthodoxy, a questioning of the assumed wisdom of the self-regulating market. Thus, the pre-war world, seemingly anchored in the solidity of gold and the self-correcting nature of markets, was, in reality, a landscape of shifting intellectual currents. The comfortable assumptions of the past were being challenged. The foundations of economic thought were being questioned. The stage was set for a dramatic clash of ideas, a battle between competing visions of stabilization and markets that would shape the economic policies of the 20th century and beyond. As we prepare to move forward, consider this. How did the perceived stability of the gold standard, in its very nature, inadvertently lay the groundwork for its own eventual rejection? Early life and influences. Keynes, Cambridge, recall our brief introduction to the tumultuous economic landscape of the 20th century. Now, let us gently shift our focus inward to the fertile intellectual soil from which one of its most influential figures sprang. John Maynard Keynes. To truly grasp the contours of his economic vision, especially its enduring tension with that of Friedrich Hayek, we must understand the formative years spent in the cloistered yet vibrant world of Cambridge. This was not simply a place of learning, it was a crucible where ideas were forged, challenged, and refined. Cambridge, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, possessed a distinct intellectual climate. It was a space steeped in the traditions of classical economics, principles of equilibrium, and self-correcting markets. The reigning paradigm, largely influenced by the teachings of Alfred Marshall, emphasized the inherent stability of the economy. Any deviations from equilibrium were considered temporary disturbances, destined to be resolved by the natural forces of supply and demand. The role of government, according to this view, was minimal, limited primarily to ensuring a level playing field and enforcing contracts. This prevailing thought acted as the riverbed upon which all other ideas would be judged. Young Keynes, however, was never one to blindly accept dogma. From an early age, he exhibited a keen intellect and a willingness to question conventional wisdom. He excelled in mathematics and philosophy before turning his attention to economics, a field he saw as uniquely positioned to address the pressing social problems of his time. His early exposure to the ideas of the classical economists deeply influenced his thinking, providing a foundational understanding of how markets were supposed to function. However, Keynes also witnessed firsthand the limitations of these models, particularly during periods of economic distress. The Bloomsbury Group, a circle of influential intellectuals and artists, exerted a profound influence on Keynes' intellectual development. This group challenged Victorian social norms and promoted open discussion of art, literature, and philosophy. Surrounded by such diverse perspectives, Keynes cultivated a critical and independent mind. He learned to appreciate the importance of individual expression and the power of unconventional thinking. These experiences instilled in him a skepticism toward rigid ideological systems and a willingness to embrace new ideas, if they seemed practical and effective. Furthermore, Keynes' involvement in public affairs, particularly his work with the British Treasury, provided him with invaluable practical experience. He witnessed firsthand the complexities of managing a national economy, observing the limitations of relying solely on theoretical models. The challenges of financing World War I, for example, exposed the inadequacy of classical economic thought in dealing with large-scale economic disruptions. It became clear to him that the invisible hand was often too slow, too weak, to prevent widespread suffering. This experience molded his understanding of practical stabilization policy. It was within this context, the intellectual rigor of Cambridge, the stimulating atmosphere of the Bloomsbury Group, and the practical challenges of public service, that Keynes began to develop his own distinct economic vision. He started to question the assumptions of the classical economist, particularly their faith in the self-correcting nature of markets. He noticed that periods of high unemployment and economic stagnation could persist for extended periods, defying the predictions of classical theory. This observation led him to believe that the economy was not always at full employment, and that government intervention might be necessary to stabilize it. In stark contrast, the early career of Friedrich Hayek, though geographically distant, was simultaneously developing a contrasting paradigm. Shaped by the Austrian school of economics, Hayek emphasized the importance of individual action, the role of prices as signals, and the dangers of central planning. For Hayek, the market was a complex and ever-evolving system that no central authority could hope to fully understand or control. This difference was foundational and would grow into a powerful stream of contrasting ideas. Keynes' growing conviction that active government intervention could mitigate economic downturns and promote stability would, in time, directly clash with the ideas of the Austrian economists. Their contrasting views on the appropriate role of government, the nature of markets, and the causes of economic fluctuations would form the basis of one of the most enduring and influential debates in the history of economics. This tension, born in the divergent intellectual streams of Cambridge and Vienna, remains with us still. As we now turn our gaze towards the turbulent years of the Great Depression, one question lingers. How would these nascent ideas fare when confronted with the most significant economic crisis of the 20th century? Chapter 3. The Young Hegelian Critique. Philosophy and Politics. The air hangs heavy, thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp earth. Picture a narrow winding street in Berlin, circa 1840. Lantern light flickers weakly, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. It was a place of vibrant intellectual ferment, a hub of artistic expression, and also a cauldron of political and economic anxieties. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast and seemingly immutable structure, was beginning to show fissures, its stability threatened by rising nationalism and simmering economic inequalities. This sense of fragility permeated the Viennese consciousness, shaping the perspectives of many young intellectuals, including Hayek. Sleep retention sets the scene of Vienna at the turn of the century. Text. Hayek's early education provided him with a rich foundation in law and the social sciences. But it was the prevailing intellectual climate that truly shaped his thinking. He was deeply influenced by the Austrian school of economics, a tradition emphasizing methodological individualism, the idea that economic phenomena must be understood by analyzing the actions and motivations of individual actors. This emphasis on the individual, as opposed to aggregate entities, would become a cornerstone of Hayek's later critique of macroeconomic interventions. Sleep retention focuses on the intellectual influences, particularly the Austrian school of economics. Text. Consider the implications of this perspective. If the economy is understood as a complex network of interactions between individuals, each possessing unique knowledge and responding to local conditions, then attempts to centrally manage or stabilize the economy become inherently problematic. The central planner, no matter how well-intentioned, can never possess the dispersed knowledge necessary to make optimal decisions. This limitation, the Austrian school argued, leads inevitably to unintended consequences and distortions. Sleep retention explains the implications of methodological individualism for economic intervention. Text. The First World War and its aftermath further solidified Hayek's skepticism toward centralized control. The war economies, with their extensive government intervention and price controls, had demonstrated, in his view, the dangers of suppressing market signals. The subsequent hyperinflation that ravaged Austria and Germany in the 1920s provided a stark illustration of the consequences of monetary mismanagement and the erosion of the value of money. These experiences left an indelible mark on Hayek, reinforcing his belief in the importance of sound money and fiscal discipline. Sleep retention discusses the impact of World War I and hyperinflation on Hayek's views. Text. Within this environment, Hayek began to develop his own unique perspective on the business cycle. He challenged the prevailing view, which attributed economic fluctuations to external shocks or inherent instability in the market system. Instead, he argued that business cycles are often caused by monetary policy itself. Specifically, he contended that artificially low interest rates, engineered by central banks, distort the allocation of capital, leading to unsustainable booms and inevitable busts. This theory, known as the Austrian business cycle theory, would become a central pillar of Hayek's economic philosophy. Sleep retention introduces the Austrian business cycle theory as a core element of Hayek's philosophy. Text. Hayek's Vienna, then, was not merely a backdrop but an active participant in the shaping of his economic vision. It was a city where the limitations of centralized power were acutely felt, where the fragility of economic institutions was readily apparent, and where the importance of individual action and dispersed knowledge was deeply appreciated. These experiences instilled in Hayek a profound distrust of government intervention and a steadfast belief in the power of free markets to allocate resources efficiently and promote long-term prosperity. Sleep retention summarizes the influence of Vienna on Hayek's economic vision. Text. As we prepare to move forward, one question lingers. How did these early experiences influence his later debates with the policymaker, and what practical implications did their differing visions have on the economic policies of the 20th century and beyond? That, dear friends, is where we turn next. Sleep retention ends with a lingering question about the next stage, bridging to the next topic, Hayek's debates and their implications. Mood, intellectual, soothing, analytical. Chapter 4. World War I. And its economic scars now. After our consideration of the gold standard's rise and fall, we arrive at a particularly tumultuous period, the years encompassing and immediately following the First World War. This catastrophic event didn't just reshape political landscapes, it irrevocably altered the economic terrain, laying bare vulnerabilities and triggering debates that still echo today. Among the most profound of these debates lies the contrast between two towering intellects, two fundamentally different visions of how to stabilize economies and manage markets in the face of such unprecedented upheaval. A conceptual divergence we might term Keynes versus Hayek. The war itself was an economic engine of destruction. Nations, previously operating within a semblance of international trade and financial equilibrium, poured their resources into a singular, devastating endeavor. Production shifted to war material, trade routes were disrupted, and governments amassed enormous debts. The existing economic order, predicated on relatively free markets and balanced budgets, crumbled under the weight of wartime exigencies. Post-war, the challenge was immense: how to rebuild shattered economies, manage crippling debt, and prevent future conflicts rooted, at least in part, in economic instability. It was amidst this turmoil that the competing visions of economic stabilization began to crystallize. On one side stood what would become known as Keynesian economics. The policymaker, witnessing the widespread unemployment and economic stagnation that plagued the post-war world, argued that government intervention was not just desirable. He saw the economy as a complex machine prone to periods of malfunction. During downturns, he believed, the market mechanism alone was insufficient to restore equilibrium. The policymaker advocated for active fiscal policy, government spending, and tax cuts to stimulate demand and put idle resources back to work. He believed that a temporary increase in government debt was a small price to pay for avoiding prolonged periods of mass unemployment and economic despair. His focus was on the short term, on alleviating immediate suffering and restoring confidence. He famously quipped, "In the long run, we are all dead," a sentiment that underscored his pragmatism and his belief that immediate action was paramount. In stark contrast stood the Austrian perspective, championed by those who would later be associated with Hayek. This view emphasized the importance of free markets and limited government intervention. The classical economist, deeply skeptical of government's ability to fine-tune the economy, argued that intervention, even with the best of intentions, often led to unintended consequences and distortions. He saw the market not as a machine, but as a complex, evolving organism, capable of self-correction if left undisturbed. The classical economist believed that wartime inflation and subsequent economic downturns were a direct result of government manipulation of money and credit. He argued that artificially low interest rates, fueled by central bank intervention, created unsustainable booms, followed by inevitable busts. He warned against excessive government debt, arguing that it crowded out private investment and hindered long-term economic growth. His focus was on the long term, on preserving the integrity of the market mechanism and avoiding the pitfalls of intervention. These two visions, while seemingly opposed, both stemmed from a desire to understand and improve the functioning of the economic system. The policymaker saw government as a necessary tool for mitigating the inherent instability of the market. The classical economist, conversely, viewed government as a potential source of instability, best kept in check to allow the market to operate freely. This tension, this perpetual debate between intervention and laissez-faire, continues to shape economic policy to this day. The interwar period became, in many ways, a testing ground for these competing ideas. Some nations experimented with Keynesian-style policies, while others clung to more orthodox, laissez-faire approaches. The results were mixed, often complicated by political instability and international tensions. The Great Depression, which followed the stock market crash of 1929, served as a particularly acute challenge, testing the limits of both approaches. Did governments intervene enough? Did their interventions exacerbate the downturn? These questions remain subjects of intense debate among economic historians. As we move into the post-World War II era, we will observe how these competing visions continued to evolve and influence economic policy on a global scale. The Bretton Woods system, the rise of welfare states, and the subsequent challenges of inflation and stagflation would all be viewed through the lenses of these ongoing debates. But before we embark on that journey, consider this. How did the economic experiences of nations that followed different policy paths during the interwar years ultimately shape their post-war economic trajectories? Keynes, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Having explored the foundational assumptions of equilibrium, we now turn to a pivotal moment, a juncture where theoretical abstraction collided with the harsh realities of a post-war world. John Maynard Keynes. The Economic Consequences of the Peace. This work isn't merely a critique of the Treaty of Versailles, it's a watershed moment in economic thought, seeding a divergence of opinion that resonates even today, the echoes of which we hear in the debates between Keynes and Hayek, two titans whose shadows still loom large. Keynes, a man of both theoretical brilliance and practical experience as a treasury official, saw the treaty not as a guarantor of lasting peace, but as a recipe for economic disaster. The punitive reparations demanded of Germany, he argued, were not only morally questionable but economically unsustainable. They would cripple the German economy, rendering it unable to both pay its debts and participate in the recovery of Europe as a whole. This, in turn, would destabilize the entire international system, sowing the seeds of future conflict. His analysis rested on a different view of how economies function than that held by the prevailing classical economists of the time. The classical economist generally held a strong belief in the self-correcting nature of markets. Supply and demand, left to their own devices, would eventually find equilibrium. Recessions, while unpleasant, were simply periods of adjustment, clearing out inefficiencies and paving the way for renewed growth. Government intervention in this view was usually counterproductive, distorting market signals and hindering the natural healing process. Keynes, however, saw things differently. He believed that markets, particularly in the short run, could be prone to prolonged periods of disequilibrium. Demand, he argued, was not always guaranteed to adjust swiftly to changes in supply, particularly during times of uncertainty and economic distress. A lack of aggregate demand could lead to a vicious cycle of falling production, rising unemployment, and further declines in demand. In such situations, the economy could become trapped in a low equilibrium state, unable to self-correct. The Economic Consequences of the Peace implicitly laid the groundwork for Keynes's later masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. He began to subtly champion the role of the policymaker, to actively manage aggregate demand, primarily through fiscal policy, government spending and taxation. By increasing government spending during a recession, Keynes argued, the government could inject demand into the economy, boosting production and employment, thereby breaking the cycle of decline. He believed the state had a duty to manage the system when it failed to self-regulate. In contrast, Hayek and others later vehemently resisted this line of thinking. The Austrians stressed the importance of individual action, spontaneous order, and the price mechanism as an information system. Central planning, even in the form of demand management, they argued, was inherently flawed. The policymaker could never possess the knowledge necessary to effectively steer the economy, and attempts to do so would inevitably lead to unintended consequences and distortions. Hayek, in particular, emphasized the role of credit cycles and malinvestment as the primary drivers of economic instability, rather than fluctuations in aggregate demand. He saw government intervention as exacerbating these problems, rather than solving them. This difference in perspective formed the basis of the famous Keynes-Hayek debates, a clash of titans that continues to shape economic policy today. One side emphasizes the need for active government intervention to stabilize the economy and address market failures, while the other emphasizes the importance of free markets, limited government, and the dangers of central planning. The consequences of the Treaty of Versailles provided the backdrop for this debate, highlighting the profound implications of economic policy for global stability and prosperity. As we gently drift forward, it is important to note that the pendulum of economic thought perpetually swings. The global financial crisis of 2008 prompted a resurgence of Keynesian ideas, with governments around the world implementing massive stimulus packages to combat the recession. Now, the world grapples with inflation, supply chain snarls, and the looming threat of recession. Does the Keynesian framework still hold relevance in this new context, Or does Hayek's emphasis on market signals and the limits of government intervention offer a more compelling guide? This is a question that continues to occupy the minds of economists and policymakers alike, and one that will undoubtedly shape the economic landscape of the years to come. The Austrian school's theory of capital and interest, having considered the classical approach and its inherent vulnerabilities exposed by cyclical downturns, we now turn to a very different perspective, one that challenges the very foundations of macroeconomic intervention. This is the Austrian school, and its unique understanding of capital and interest forms the bedrock of its critique. Their vision of stabilization, far from active manipulation, rests upon the natural, self-correcting forces of the market. The Austrian school, at its core, emphasizes methodological individualism, the idea that all economic phenomena are ultimately the result of individual choices and actions. This focus extends to their understanding of capital. Unlike some models that treat capital as a homogeneous blob, the Austrians see it as a complex, heterogeneous structure. Imagine a vast, interconnected network of partially completed projects, each reliant on specific resources and anticipating future consumer demand. This capital structure is not simply more or less productive. It is delicately balanced, each stage contributing to the eventual finished good. Now, consider the role of interest. The Austrian school views interest not merely as a financial phenomenon dictated by central banks, but as a fundamental reflection of time preference. Time preference is the innate human tendency to value satisfaction sooner rather than later. We prefer consumption today over consumption tomorrow. Interest, therefore, is the price that borrowers must pay to induce lenders to postpone their consumption, to delay gratification. It is the market's way of coordinating savings and investment. Within this framework, booms and busts are not inherent features of capitalism, but rather the consequences of distortions to the interest rate. Consider a scenario where the policymaker, through expansionary monetary policy, artificially lowers interest rates below their natural level, that is, the level reflecting genuine time preferences. This cheap credit signals to entrepreneurs that there are more savings available than actually exist. They embark on long-term investment projects that appear profitable at the artificially low interest rate. This is where the malinvestment begins. Resources are diverted from producing goods consumers want now to projects that want yield returns for years. As these projects progress, the underlying scarcity of resources becomes apparent. The increased demand for labor and raw materials bids up their prices, eroding the profitability of the longer-term investments. The market begins to correct, revealing the misallocation of capital caused by the artificially low interest rates. The boom turns to bust as projects are abandoned, workers are laid off, and the economy contracts. The Austrian prescription for stability is therefore not active intervention to stimulate demand, but rather allowing the market to naturally adjust. The policymaker, in their view, should refrain from manipulating interest rates and allow them to reflect genuine time preferences. This promotes a more sustainable allocation of capital and avoids the boom-bust cycle caused by malinvestment. This stands in stark contrast to the Keynesian approach, which emphasizes the need for government intervention to stabilize aggregate demand. The Austrian school argues that such intervention only exacerbates the problem by further distorting market signals and delaying the necessary corrections. The classical economist, in their view, offers a better path to long-run prosperity by fostering a sound monetary policy and minimizing government interference. However, questions remain. Is the Austrian model too idealized? Can the market truly self-correct quickly enough to prevent prolonged suffering during a recession? And what role, if any, should government play in providing a safety net for those displaced by economic downturns? As we navigate the complexities of economic thought, we must consider the limitations and strengths of each perspective, always striving for a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our economic landscape. What alternatives beyond the Austrian vision might offer a blend of stability and growth? What hybrid models have been put forth, borrowing from different schools of thought? The business cycle, Mises' critique of credit expansion. We've explored the architecture of free markets, their inherent capacity for coordination, and the price mechanism that serves as its information highway. Now, let us gently turn our attention to a persistent challenge to that coordination: the business cycle. And within that challenge, consider the Austrian perspective, particularly as articulated by Ludwig von Mises, on the role of credit expansion. Mises offered a powerful critique of interventions designed to stabilize the economy, a critique that sits in stark contrast to the theories we often associate with Keynes. To understand this contrast, we must first appreciate the Austrian view of capital structure. Imagine a river, flowing from its source high in the mountains down to the sea. This river represents the production process. At the source, raw materials are extracted. Further downstream, they are transformed into intermediate goods, and finally, at the mouth of the river, finished consumer products emerge. This is capital structure, a series of interconnected stages, each dependent on the others. The allocation of resources across these stages is guided by interest rates, acting as a signal reflecting the relative scarcity of capital and the time preferences of consumers. Higher interest rates signal greater scarcity and encourage savings. Lower rates, the opposite. The Austrian critique centers on artificial manipulation of these interest rates, specifically through credit expansion by central banks. Let's suppose, for instance, that the policymaker, aiming to stimulate economic activity, lowers interest rates below their natural level, the level that would prevail in a free market without intervention. This creates the illusion of greater available savings. Entrepreneurs, seeing these artificially low rates, embark on new investment projects, particularly those in the earlier stages of production, upstream on our river, if you will. These are often longer-term, more capital-intensive projects, which would not have been undertaken had interest rates accurately reflected the true availability of savings. The problem is that the actual amount of savings has not increased. Consumers, still preferring to consume rather than save, continue to demand goods and services in the later stages of production, downstream. The increased investment upstream is not matched by sufficient savings to sustain it. This mismatch sets the stage for a bust. Resources are drawn away from the later stages of production to support these unsustainable, longer-term projects. This leads to shortages of consumer goods, rising prices, and eventually, the realization that these earlier stage investments were malinvestments, investments that cannot be profitably completed given the existing resource constraints and consumer preferences. The inevitable consequence, according to Mises, is a correction. The bubble bursts. These unsustainable projects must be liquidated. Capital is reallocated, often painfully, back towards the later stages of production to better align with consumer demand. This is the recession or depression phase of the business cycle. It is not, as some argue, a failure of the market, but rather the necessary correction of the distortions created by artificial credit expansion. Attempts by the policymaker to further postpone or prevent this correction, through further credit expansion or other interventions, only prolong the agony and exacerbate the underlying imbalances. Consider the alternative view, often associated with Keynes. This perspective tends to focus on aggregate demand. When faced with a recession, the policymaker is encouraged to stimulate demand through government spending or monetary policy, even if it means running deficits or further expanding credit. The idea is to boost overall economic activity and prevent a downward spiral. The classical economist, of course, would counter that this approach ignores the underlying structural imbalances and the distortions caused by the initial credit expansion. It's akin to treating the symptoms of a disease while ignoring the root cause. Further interventions in this view merely mask the problem and postpone the inevitable correction. The contrasting visions are fundamentally about the role of government and the nature of the market. The Austrian perspective emphasizes the self-regulating capacity of the market when left free from intervention and the importance of sound money and stable prices. The alternative emphasizes the need for active intervention to stabilize the economy and mitigate the effects of recessions. These differing viewpoints are still debated today, shaping policy decisions and influencing our understanding of the business cycle. As we conclude this exploration of the Misesian critique, consider, if credit expansion truly initiates the cycle, what form might the corrective phase take in an environment of unprecedented central bank activity? Chapter 8. Keynes' Early Views on Monetary Policy. We've traced the contours of early economic thought, witnessed the rise of classical models, and felt the tremors of emerging dissent. Now, let us turn our attention to the formative years of a figure who would fundamentally reshape our understanding of economic stability, John Maynard Keynes. Before the grand pronouncements of the general theory, before the large-scale interventions advocated during the Great Depression, there was a younger Keynes, wrestling with the intricacies of monetary policy, within a landscape still dominated by classical precepts. His early views, while evolving, already hinted at the intellectual revolution to come, and formed a crucial point of divergence from those, like Hayek, who saw the market's inherent self-correcting abilities as paramount. This divergence, this nascent Keynes versus Hayek, centered upon the role of central banks and the efficacy of monetary interventions. In the early 20th century, the prevailing orthodoxy held that the market, left largely to its own devices, possessed a powerful tendency towards equilibrium. Fluctuations, while acknowledged, were seen as temporary deviations around a fundamentally stable trend. Monetary policy, in this context, was primarily viewed as a tool to maintain price stability, often through adherence to the gold standard. The classical economist, believing in the inherent flexibility of wages and prices, argued that any imbalances would be swiftly corrected by market forces. If there was unemployment, for instance, wages would fall, businesses would become more profitable, and employment would naturally increase. Any attempts by the government to interfere with this process, they believed, would only distort the natural forces and prolong the adjustment. Keynes, even in his earlier works, harbored significant reservations about this laissez-faire approach. While he did not entirely reject the classical framework, he began to emphasize the possibility of persistent disequilibrium. He questioned the automaticity of self-correction, particularly in the labor market. He observed, even before the crushing weight of the Great Depression, that wages were often sticky, meaning they didn't adjust downward as readily as classical theory predicted. Factors such as social contracts, union bargaining, and psychological resistance to wage cuts could prevent the labor market from clearing efficiently. This observation led Keynes to consider the potential for demand-side policies to play a more active role in stabilizing the economy. Specifically, he began to explore the possibilities of monetary policy as a tool to influence aggregate demand, the total demand for goods and services in the economy. If demand was weak, leading to unemployment and economic stagnation, Keynes argued that the central bank could stimulate economic activity by lowering interest rates. Lower interest rates would encourage businesses to invest, consumers to spend, and ultimately, boost overall demand. However, Keynes' early views on monetary policy were far from a simple endorsement of aggressive intervention. He was acutely aware of the limitations of monetary policy and the potential for unintended consequences. He recognized that interest rates could only be lowered so far before hitting the zero lower bound, beyond which further reductions would be ineffective. He also understood that monetary policy operates with a lag, meaning that the effects of a policy change may not be fully felt for several months or even years. This lag introduces uncertainty and makes it difficult for policymakers to fine-tune the economy. Furthermore, Keynes, at this stage, wasn't advocating for the abandonment of sound money principles. While questioning the rigidity of the gold standard, he understood the importance of maintaining price stability. Excessive monetary expansion, he warned, could lead to inflation, which would erode purchasing power and undermine economic confidence. Therefore, Keynes' early approach to monetary policy can be characterized as a cautious and pragmatic one. He saw it as a valuable tool for stabilizing the economy, but one that should be used judiciously and with a clear understanding of its limitations. He diverged from the classical economists' complete faith in market self-correction and the Austrian school's fear of intervention, instead carving a middle path, advocating for intervention, but with careful consideration of the potential pitfalls. This nuanced perspective foreshadowed the larger intellectual battles to come. While the classical models continued to hold sway in many circles, Keynes' early work laid the groundwork for a more active role for government in managing the economy. The seeds of his future clashes with figures like Hayek, who championed the free market and opposed government intervention, were already being sown. What factors would ultimately push Keynes towards his revolutionary general theory, and how would the experience of the Great Depression shape his and Hayek's competing visions? That remains to be explored. Chapter 9. The Roaring Twenties. A false prosperity? Welcome back. Last time we touched upon the disruptions of the Great War and their initial impact on the global economic order. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward the decade that followed, the 1920s, a period often painted in vibrant hues of jazz, technological marvels, and seemingly boundless prosperity. But was this prosperity genuine, a robust foundation upon which to build a lasting economic edifice? Or was it, perhaps, a gilded facade, masking deeper, more systemic vulnerabilities? To understand this era, we must introduce a crucial intellectual dichotomy, a fork in the road of economic thought, that would profoundly shape the 20th century and continues to resonate today. The competing visions of stabilization and markets, embodied in the philosophies of what, for the sake of clarity, we might term the interventionist economist and the classical economist. Their contrasting approaches offer invaluable lenses through which to analyze the apparent successes and the ultimate failures of the Roaring Twenties. Consider first the perspective of the interventionist economist. This viewpoint, reacting to the chaos and devastation of war and the perceived failures of unfettered markets, advocated for active government intervention to smooth out the business cycle, to dampen the sharp peaks of boom and the devastating troughs of bust. The rationale was simple. Markets, left to their own devices, are prone to volatility, to irrational exuberance, followed by paralyzing fear. To prevent crises, the guiding hand of fiscal and monetary policy was deemed essential. This perspective found fertile ground in the aftermath of the war. Governments, having mobilized entire economies for the war effort, were accustomed to wielding significant control. The idea that this control could be repurposed to manage peacetime economies, to steer them toward sustained growth and stability, held considerable appeal. The classical economist, on the other hand, adhered to a fundamentally different philosophy. This perspective emphasized the self-correcting nature of markets. Disruptions, imbalances, and even recessions were seen as necessary adjustments, painful perhaps, but ultimately essential for reallocating resources to their most productive uses. Government intervention, in this view, was not a cure but a hindrance, distorting price signals, creating artificial incentives, and ultimately prolonging the inevitable correction. Imagine a rushing river being dammed. The water may be stopped for a time, but pressure builds, and eventually the dam may break with even more devastating force. These diverging viewpoints offer contrasting interpretations of the economic dynamics of the 1920s. Consider the actions of central banks during this period. In many countries, particularly in the United States, monetary policy was geared toward maintaining price stability. This involved keeping interest rates relatively low, encouraging borrowing and investment. From the perspective of the interventionist economist, this was a prudent measure, supporting economic growth and preventing deflation. However, the classical economist might argue that these low interest rates artificially inflated asset prices, creating a speculative bubble, particularly in the stock market. By suppressing the natural market signals of scarcity, these policies distorted investment decisions, leading to a misallocation of capital and ultimately setting the stage for a more severe correction. Furthermore, the rapid technological advancements of the 1920s, the proliferation of automobiles, radios, and household appliances, fueled a surge in consumer spending. This, in turn, drove economic growth, but also led to increased borrowing and a buildup of debt. The interventionist economist might point to this as evidence of a virtuous cycle, where technological innovation drove investment and consumption, leading to sustained prosperity. The classical economist, however, might caution that this growth was unsustainable, built upon a foundation of easy credit and speculative investment. They might argue that the apparent prosperity was masking underlying imbalances, such as growing income inequality and overproduction in certain sectors. Ultimately, the economic boom of the 1920s proved to be unsustainable. The stock market crash of 1929 exposed the underlying vulnerabilities of the system, ushering in the Great Depression. While simplistic to attribute blame to a single factor or ideology, the contrasting perspectives of the interventionist economist and the classical economist provide valuable insights into the complex interplay of factors that contributed to the decade's rise and fall. The Roaring Twenties serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder that apparent prosperity can be deceptive, and that the pursuit of stability must be carefully balanced with the need for market forces to operate freely. As we move into the next chapter and delve into the depths of the Great Depression, we will see these competing economic philosophies clash in even more dramatic fashion. But what lasting impact did the experiences of the 20s truly have on the policymakers who would later confront the economic cataclysm of the 30s? That, perhaps, is a question for another night. Hayek's challenge to Keynes, price signals and coordination. Tonight, we delve into the countercurrent, the challenge posed by Friedrich Hayek to the burgeoning Keynesian orthodoxy. While the previous chapter illuminated the promise of government intervention to stabilize aggregate demand, Hayek offered a starkly different perspective, one rooted in the power of price signals and the spontaneous order of the market. Think of it as two rivers carving different paths through the same landscape, each seeking to navigate the economic terrain. Hayek's core argument rested on the informational role of prices. He viewed the market not as a simple mechanism for allocating goods, but as a complex communication network. Prices, in his view, were not merely numerical values, but potent signals carrying vital information about supply, demand, resource availability, and consumer preferences. These signals, constantly shifting and adjusting, guided individual actors, producers, consumers, investors, in making rational economic decisions. The classical economist, deeply influenced by Austrian economic thought, emphasized the inherent dynamism of the market. He saw it as a process of continuous discovery, where entrepreneurs constantly sought out new opportunities and adapted to changing conditions. This process, he argued, was driven by the price mechanism. A rise in price, for example, signaled scarcity, prompting producers to increase supply and consumers to moderate their demand. Conversely, a fall in price indicated abundance, encouraging consumption and discouraging further production. This perspective stood in direct contrast to the Keynesian emphasis on aggregate demand management. The policymaker, focused on stimulating overall spending, often disregarded the subtle nuances of relative prices. Hayek contended that such interventions, while seemingly beneficial in the short term, could distort these crucial price signals, leading to malinvestment and ultimately economic instability. Imagine trying to control the flow of a river by damming it in one place. You might solve an immediate problem, but you risk causing unforeseen flooding and droughts downstream. Consider, for instance, a period of artificially low interest rates, a common Keynesian tool for stimulating investment. Hayek argued that such a policy, while boosting investment in the short run, could lead to an unsustainable boom. Artificially low interest rates, he believed, would distort the price signal for capital, encouraging businesses to undertake projects that were ultimately unprofitable and unsustainable. These projects, fueled by cheap credit, would consume valuable resources and create a bubble, which would inevitably burst, leading to a painful recession. This boom-bust cycle, in Hayek's view, was a direct consequence of tampering with the price mechanism. Central to Hayek's critique was the concept of coordination. He argued that the market, through the price system, coordinated the actions of millions of individuals, each with their own unique knowledge and preferences. This coordination, he believed, was far more effective than any centralized planning or government intervention. The policymaker, no matter how well-intentioned, could never possess the dispersed knowledge necessary to effectively manage the economy. To attempt to do so was to invite inefficiency and unintended consequences. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra by only listening to the brass section. You miss the nuances and harmonies that create a complete and balanced sound. For Hayek, the market was not merely an efficient allocator of resources, but also a powerful discovery process. It allowed individuals to experiment, innovate, and learn from their mistakes. Government intervention, by suppressing price signals and limiting individual initiative, stifled this process of discovery and hindered economic progress. This focus on individual action and spontaneous order formed the bedrock of his challenge to Keynesian economics. The inherent limitations in the policymaker's knowledge, Hayek suggested, were the critical weaknesses of the model. The debate between Hayek and Keynes, therefore, was not simply about the effectiveness of government intervention, but about the very nature of the economic system. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of how markets function and how best to promote economic stability and prosperity. The legacy of this intellectual clash continues to shape economic policy debates to this day. Chapter 11. The Great Crash of 1929. A global turning point. We've traced the intricate dance of burgeoning prosperity in the Roaring Twenties, a dance now poised on the precipice of profound change. Tonight, we turn our gaze to the cataclysm that shook the foundations of that era, the Great Crash of 1929. More than just a stock market correction, it became a global turning point, an object lesson in the delicate balance, or imbalance, of economic forces. And at its heart lay a fundamental debate, a divergence of thought that continues to shape our understanding of economic stabilization and the role of markets, the competing visions, you might say, of Keynes and Hayek. The initial spark, of course, was the collapse of the stock market. The seemingly endless upward trajectory had lured investors into a speculative frenzy, fueled by readily available credit. Fortunes were made and lost on paper. But the market, like a river reaching its capacity, could absorb no more. The sudden drop triggered a cascade of panic selling, a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. Fortunes vanished overnight, leaving behind a trail of broken dreams and shattered confidence. However, the stock market crash itself was merely a symptom, not the disease. The underlying vulnerabilities in the global economy were far more profound. Overproduction in agriculture and industry, coupled with unequal distribution of wealth, had created a system teetering on the brink. When consumer demand faltered, businesses responded by cutting production and laying off workers, further depressing demand in a vicious cycle. It was in this climate of economic despair that the intellectual battle between two titans began to take shape. On one side stood the policymaker, a proponent of active government intervention. He saw the market as inherently unstable, prone to periods of irrational exuberance and devastating contractions. His solution was to use fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, to smooth out these fluctuations, to inject demand into the economy during downturns and cool it down during booms. He believed that unemployment was a consequence of insufficient aggregate demand, and that the government had a responsibility to create jobs and stimulate spending. Imagine a skilled gardener tending a wilting plant. The policymaker would argue that the plant needs immediate nourishment, a dose of government spending to revitalize its drooping leaves. This intervention, he believed, would restore the plant to health, allowing it to flourish once more. On the other side stood the classical economist, a staunch defender of free markets. He believed that markets, left to their own devices, would eventually correct themselves. Government intervention, in his view, only distorted market signals and prolonged the recovery process. He argued that artificially stimulating demand would lead to inflation and misallocation of resources, creating even bigger problems down the road. The natural processes of market adjustment, painful as they might be, were the only way to restore long-term stability. The classical economist would see that same wilting plant and argue that interfering will only mask the underlying soil problem. The market needs to adjust itself. This way, the plant will flourish in the long run, or be displaced if something better is suited to the environment. The Great Depression became a testing ground for these competing philosophies. The policymakers' ideas gained increasing influence as the economic crisis deepened, leading to the adoption of policies like the New Deal in the United States. These policies, aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform, involved massive government spending on public works projects, social security programs, and financial regulations. While the effectiveness of these policies remains a subject of debate, they undeniably marked a turning point in the relationship between government and the economy. The contrasting approaches to stabilization, active intervention versus free market adjustment, continue to resonate today. The legacy of the Great Crash is not just an economic history lesson. It is a reminder of the inherent complexities of economic systems and the enduring debate over the appropriate role of government in managing them. And this conflict of intervention versus market is still heavily debated to this day. As we prepare to drift into the next phase, we might ponder: did the policies adopted in response to the Great Depression truly provide a lasting solution, or did they simply lay the groundwork for new challenges in the decades to come? What seeds were sown, and what fruits did they bear? The debate begins. Hayek versus Keynes. At the LSE, we have journeyed through the turbulent waters of the gold standard and the rising tides of protectionism. Now, as we settle into a deeper understanding, we arrive at a pivotal point, a confluence of thought, where two monumental figures began to shape the very bedrock of modern economic understanding. The London School of Economics, in the early 1930s, became the unlikely arena for a clash of titans, a debate that resonates even today. It was here, amidst the hallowed halls and the scent of aged books, that the intellectual battle between what we now understand as Keynesian and Hayekian thought truly took form. The atmosphere at the LSE was one of rigorous inquiry. Students, eager to dissect the ailing economic landscape, found themselves captivated by two opposing approaches. One, championed by the emerging figure advocating for governmental intervention, promised immediate relief from the agonizing grip of the Great Depression. The other, rooted in classical liberalism, warned against the perils of tampering with the market's inherent self-correcting mechanisms. The debate was not merely academic. It was a question of survival, of charting a course through the storm. Picture the scene. A dimly lit lecture hall, filled with earnest faces. The voice of the advocate for government action, measured and persuasive, cutting through the air. He argued that the market, left to its own devices, was failing. Aggregate demand, the total spending in the economy, had collapsed, leaving businesses idle and workers unemployed. The solution, as he saw it, lay in injecting demand directly into the system through government spending, public works projects, infrastructure development, anything to stimulate activity and break the downward spiral. He presented his case with compelling logic. He saw the economy as a complex machine, prone to breakdowns. When these occurred, a skilled mechanic, the government, was needed to step in, make adjustments, and get the machine running smoothly again. This intervention, he argued, was not a permanent fixture, but rather a temporary measure to restore equilibrium. In contrast, the defender of free markets, with his Austrian perspective, presented a different vision. He saw the economy not as a machine, but as a living organism, constantly adapting and evolving. He argued that government intervention, far from being a cure, would only distort the natural signals of the market, prices, that guided resource allocation. Artificially stimulating demand, he cautioned, would create unsustainable booms, followed by inevitable and even more painful busts. He emphasized the importance of sound money and limited government. He believed that the seeds of the Depression were sown in the inflationary policies of the 1920s, when central banks artificially lowered interest rates, encouraging malinvestment, investments that appeared profitable only because of the distorted price signals. The subsequent correction, the Depression, was simply the market's way of cleansing itself of these imbalances. The crux of their disagreement lay in their understanding of the market's inherent stability. The policymaker, confident in the ability of fiscal policy to steer the economy, saw the market as inherently unstable, prone to fluctuations that required active management. The classical economist, deeply skeptical of central planning, saw the market as fundamentally self-regulating, with its own internal mechanisms for restoring equilibrium, if only left undisturbed. The debate at the LSE was not a winner-take-all affair. It was the beginning of a long and complex conversation, a continuous dialectic that has shaped economic policy ever since. Each perspective offered valuable insights, and the challenge has always been to find the right balance between intervention and laissez-faire. The influence of the policymaker would rise to prominence in the following decades, particularly during the post-war era. As we reflect on these formative years, a question lingers. How would the evolving global landscape, with its increasing interconnectedness and complexity, further challenge these competing visions of stabilization and markets? This is a question that will guide our exploration in the chapters to come, as we delve deeper into the legacy of this intellectual clash and its enduring relevance in the modern world. Chapter 13. Hayek's Prices and Production. Misallocation of Capital. Hayek, observing the boom-bust cycles that plagued economies, sought to diagnose the underlying ailment. His diagnosis, however, differed fundamentally from the emerging Keynesian perspective. While the Keynesian economist emphasized aggregate demand failures and the need for government intervention to stimulate spending, Hayek focused on the structure of production and the distortions introduced by artificially low interest rates. Imagine, if you will, the economy as a finely balanced ecosystem. Resources flow from raw materials to intermediate goods to final consumption, a complex web of interconnected activities. Interest rates, in this ecosystem, act as crucial signals, guiding entrepreneurs and investors in their allocation of capital. They reflect the relative scarcity of savings and the time preferences of consumers. High interest rates signal that savings are scarce, encouraging investment in projects with quicker returns. Low interest rates, conversely, suggest an abundance of savings, paving the way for longer-term, more capital-intensive projects. Hayek argued that central bank intervention, specifically the artificial lowering of interest rates below their natural level, disrupts this delicate balance. This manipulation, often undertaken with the laudable goal of stimulating economic activity, creates a mirage of available capital. Entrepreneurs, perceiving low borrowing costs, embark on investment projects that would otherwise be unprofitable. These investments tend to be concentrated in the earlier stages of production, the higher-order goods like machinery and equipment needed for future consumption. Think of it like constructing a grand cathedral. The initial phases, laying the foundation, erecting the walls, require significant upfront investment and yield no immediate return. Only after years of labor and expense does the cathedral finally open its doors, delivering its intended service. The problem, according to Hayek, arises when these higher-order investments are not supported by genuine savings. Consumers, lured by the apparent prosperity of the boom, continue to consume at their usual rate. This creates a mismatch between the structure of production, which is shifting towards long-term projects, and the structure of demand, which remains focused on immediate gratification. The foundation of our cathedral is being laid, but no one is donating to the construction fund. Eventually, the truth is revealed. The initial boom, fueled by artificial credit expansion, proves unsustainable. As resources become scarce, the costs of completing the higher-order projects rise. Some projects are abandoned mid-construction, leaving behind half-finished factories and idle equipment. The misallocation of capital becomes apparent, leading to a bust, a painful period of readjustment where resources are reallocated to more sustainable uses. This Austrian business cycle theory, as it came to be known, paints a starkly different picture from the Keynesian view. The Keynesian economist sees the bust as a failure of aggregate demand, a self-fulfilling prophecy of pessimism and underspending. The Hayekian economist, however, sees it as the inevitable consequence of earlier distortions, a necessary correction to a misallocation of resources. The policymaker, faced with the onset of a recession, is thus presented with two vastly different courses of action. The Keynesian approach advocates for government spending and monetary easing to stimulate demand and jumpstart the economy. The Hayekian approach, on the other hand, urges restraint, allowing the market to correct the imbalances and reallocate capital to its most productive uses, however painful the process may be. This fundamental disagreement highlights the core of the Keynes versus Hayek debate. Is the economy inherently unstable, prone to demand failures that require active government intervention? Or is it a self-regulating system that, when left undisturbed, will naturally gravitate towards equilibrium, even if the path is fraught with occasional turbulence? And what role, if any, should the central bank play in managing these fluctuations? These questions, debated then with fervor, continue to resonate today, shaping economic policy and influencing our understanding of the complex interplay between markets and government. What new challenges will the next economic era present, and how will these competing visions guide our response? Chapter 14. Keynes' initial responses to the Depression. Having traced the descent into the Great Depression, we now turn to the intellectual currents, attempting to navigate its turbulent waters. One of the most significant of these currents stemmed from the evolving thought of John Maynard Keynes, an economist whose ideas would come to redefine the relationship between government and the market. His initial responses to the crisis, mark the beginning of a long and often contentious debate, a debate encapsulated by the simplified yet enduring framing of Keynes versus Hayek, competing visions of stabilization and markets. To understand Keynes's initial reactions, we must first recall the prevailing economic orthodoxy. The classical economist, steeped in Say's law, believed that markets, left to their own devices, possessed inherent self-correcting mechanisms. Recessions, though painful, were seen as temporary adjustments, necessary purges of inefficient businesses. Intervention, particularly by governments, was viewed as disruptive, interfering with the natural balancing forces. The focus was on maintaining a balanced budget, allowing wages and prices to fall, and trusting that supply would eventually create its own demand. Keynes, however, saw the Depression as something altogether different, a systemic failure, a breakdown of the very mechanisms that classical theory presumed to be reliable. He observed mass unemployment, not as a temporary dislocation, but as a persistent and deepening crisis. He questioned the idea that falling wages would automatically restore full employment, arguing that they could instead lead to a decrease in overall demand, further exacerbating the problem. This was a crucial departure, a shift in perspective from individual market adjustments to the dynamics of the economy as a whole. His initial prescriptions, therefore, centered on stimulating aggregate demand. If the private sector was unable or unwilling to spend, then the government had a responsibility to step in. This was not merely a charitable act, but a necessary intervention to prevent the downward spiral from intensifying. Public works projects, infrastructure development, these were not simply ways to create jobs, but mechanisms to inject purchasing power into the economy, setting off a multiplier effect, a cascade of spending and income generation. The policymaker, facing unprecedented economic hardship, found some aspects of Keynes's early arguments appealing. The idea that government could actively manage the economy, rather than passively observing its fluctuations, offered a sense of control in a seemingly uncontrollable situation. However, these initial Keynesian approaches were often met with resistance, particularly from those wedded to traditional fiscal conservatism. The prospect of increased government debt was viewed with alarm, and the efficacy of public spending was questioned. Were these projects truly productive, or simply wasteful expenditures that would ultimately burden future generations? This nascent Keynesianism, however, did not yet represent the fully developed theory that would emerge later in the 1930s. Keynes was still grappling with the complexities of the Depression, refining his arguments and seeking to provide a more comprehensive framework for understanding and addressing economic crises. His early ideas, while impactful, were more intuitive responses to the immediate crisis than a fully articulated theoretical edifice. In contrast, the Austrian school, represented by figures like Friedrich Hayek, offered a fundamentally different diagnosis and prescription. They saw the Depression not as a failure of capitalism, but as a consequence of earlier government interventions, particularly excessive credit creation by central banks. Artificially low interest rates, they argued, had led to malinvestment, a misallocation of resources into unsustainable projects. The solution, therefore, was not further intervention, but a return to sound money, fiscal discipline, and allowing the market to correct its past mistakes, however painful that correction might be. The tension between these competing visions, the Keynesian emphasis on demand-side management and the Austrian emphasis on supply-side fundamentals, would define much of the economic debate in the years to come. It represents a fundamental disagreement about the role of government, the nature of markets, and the very stability of the economic system. The question of whether the market is a self-correcting mechanism best left alone, or a complex system requiring active management, continues to resonate today. As we move forward, we must consider how these initial responses evolved, how the Keynesian framework solidified, and how the debate with the Austrian school continued to shape economic policy in the years leading up to and during World War II. What further refinements and challenges did each perspective face as the economic landscape continued to shift? Chapter 15. The Rise of Interventionist Policies, Worldwide. Good evening. We've previously explored the inherent cyclical nature of market economies, the ebb and flow of prosperity and recession. Now, let us gently drift towards a consideration of how societies have historically attempted to navigate these turbulent waters, specifically through the lens of competing economic philosophies. The central tension, the intellectual fulcrum, rests on the degree to which governments should actively steer the economic ship. One perspective, often tracing its roots back to the classical economist, emphasizes the self-correcting mechanism of markets. In this view, recessionary forces, while painful, ultimately purge inefficiencies, rebalancing the economy through price adjustments and resource reallocation. Government intervention, in this context, is seen as a disruption, a meddling hand that prolongs the necessary, albeit unpleasant, cleansing process. The inherent stability of the system, like a pendulum, eventually finding its equilibrium, is paramount. Policies should foster free trade, sound money, and limited government spending, allowing the market to naturally return to its potential. The alternative viewpoint, championed by the interventionist economist, arises from a deep concern about the human cost of prolonged economic downturns. Seeing mass unemployment and widespread hardship, this school of thought advocates for active government intervention to stabilize demand and stimulate growth. The rationale is rooted in the belief that markets, left entirely to their own devices, can become trapped in self-reinforcing negative spirals. Decreased spending leads to reduced production, further job losses, and a continued decline in demand. Like a stalled engine, the economy needs a jump start. The policymaker, faced with the real-world pressures of political accountability and social unrest, often finds themselves drawn towards the interventionist approach. The promise of immediate relief and the ability to visibly address economic anxieties can be politically compelling. Large-scale government spending programs, tax cuts designed to boost consumer spending, and monetary policies aimed at lowering interest rates are all tools within this interventionist toolkit. The aim is to inject demand into the economy, creating a positive feedback loop of increased production, employment, and investment. However, the inherent challenges of interventionist policies should not be overlooked. The timing and scale of interventions are crucial. Too little, too late, and the effort is ineffectual. Too much, too soon, and the economy risks overheating, leading to inflation and asset bubbles. Furthermore, government spending must be financed, either through taxation or borrowing. Higher taxes can dampen incentives to work and invest, while excessive borrowing can lead to unsustainable debt burdens and future economic instability. There is a delicate balance, a narrow channel, that must be navigated. The historical record offers a rich tapestry of examples of both approaches in action. Periods of laissez-faire capitalism, with minimal government involvement, have often been punctuated by significant economic volatility. Conversely, eras of active government intervention have witnessed periods of both rapid growth and inflationary excess. No single approach has proven universally successful, and the optimal policy response often depends on the specific circumstances of each economic crisis. The nature of the shock, the structural characteristics of the economy, and the political context all play a role in determining the effectiveness of any particular policy intervention. In the wake of significant economic downturns, such as the Great Depression and the global financial crisis, we have observed a widespread embrace of interventionist policies across the globe. Governments have implemented massive stimulus packages, bailed out failing institutions, and engaged in unprecedented levels of monetary easing. These actions, while intended to prevent economic collapse, have also raised questions about the long-term consequences of such interventions. Have they created a dependency on government support? Have they distorted market signals and incentivized excessive risk-taking? These are questions that continue to be debated by economists and policymakers alike. As we reflect on the rise of interventionist policies, we are left with a fundamental question. What are the long-term implications for market efficiency and economic stability when the state takes on an increasingly active role in managing the economy? And how does this shift reshape the boundaries between individual liberty and collective responsibility? As we move forward, consider how the pendulum will swing as economies grapple with the consequences of these policies and navigate the next phase of economic evolution. Chapter 16. The General Theory, Revolutionizing Macroeconomics. We've explored the foundations of economic thought, the rise of classical economics, and the seeds of doubt that began to sprout. Now, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a paradigm shift sparked by a single, profoundly influential work, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Imagine the economic landscape of the 1930s. The Great Depression gripped the world. Classical economics, with its emphasis on self-correcting markets and the inherent stability of the system, seemed utterly unable to explain, let alone alleviate, the widespread suffering. The prevailing wisdom held that unemployment was largely voluntary, a result of workers demanding wages above the market clearing level. The policymaker, clinging to these principles, largely stood aside, believing that intervention would only prolong the inevitable readjustment. Into this intellectual and practical vacuum stepped the general theory. Its author, a brilliant and iconoclastic economist, presented a radically different view. He argued that the economy was not inherently self-correcting, particularly in the short run. Demand, or rather the lack of it, could stagnate, leading to persistent unemployment and economic depression. This wasn't merely a theoretical quibble. It had profound implications for policy. If demand was the problem, then stimulating demand became the solution. The general theory posited that insufficient aggregate demand, the total spending in the economy, could lead to a situation where businesses lacked the incentive to invest and hire, even if wages were low. Individuals, fearing job losses or economic uncertainty, might hoard their savings, further depressing demand in a self-reinforcing cycle. This concept, known as the paradox of thrift, suggested that what was rational behavior for an individual, saving for a rainy day, could be disastrous for the economy as a whole. The proposed remedy was government intervention. The policymaker, according to this new perspective, had a crucial role to play in stabilizing the economy. By increasing government spending or cutting taxes, they could inject demand into the system, boosting investment, creating jobs, and breaking the cycle of recession. This marked a dramatic departure from the laissez-faire approach of classical economics. It advocated for active fiscal policy, using government tools to manage the ebb and flow of the economy. However, this new paradigm did not go unchallenged. A prominent critic, also a brilliant economist, held a contrasting vision. This individual, let's call him the Austrian economist, saw the business cycle not as a failure of aggregate demand, but as a consequence of distorted market signals caused by government intervention, particularly through manipulation of interest rates. Artificially low interest rates, he argued, led to malinvestment, directing resources into unsustainable projects that would inevitably collapse when the underlying distortions were revealed. The Austrian economist believed that the free market, though prone to occasional fluctuations, was ultimately the most efficient allocator of resources. Government intervention, in his view, only exacerbated the problem, creating new distortions and delaying the necessary adjustments. He advocated for a hands-off approach, allowing the market to cleanse itself of malinvestment and restore a sustainable equilibrium. This clash of ideas, the proponents of demand management versus the defenders of free markets, has shaped the course of macroeconomic thought ever since. The one side emphasizing the need for stabilization and government intervention, while the other prioritizes the efficiency of markets and the dangers of government overreach. It represents a fundamental tension between different visions of how the economy works and what role the policymaker should play. The general theory and its subsequent influence dramatically altered the landscape, paving the way for new macroeconomic models and policy frameworks. But the debate between these competing visions, intervention versus non-intervention, stabilization versus market discipline, continues to resonate today, shaping economic policy and influencing our understanding of the complex forces that drive the economy. The question remains, as we move towards the next phase of economic thought, how can we best navigate the inherent trade-offs between stability and efficiency, between the guiding hand of the policymaker and the invisible hand of the market? Chapter 17. Aggregate demand and the multiplier effect. We've been examining the foundations of economic thought, the underlying assumptions that shape how we perceive the ebb and flow of economic activity. Now, we gently turn our attention to a central debate, a persistent current in the stream of economic discourse, the contrasting visions of stabilization and markets offered by two intellectual titans. This is the realm of aggregate demand, the force that shapes short-term fluctuations, and the fascinating multiplier effect, which amplifies the impact of economic interventions. And at the heart of it all, the intellectual dance of Keynes versus Hayek. Imagine a still pond. A pebble is dropped. The ripples spread outwards, gradually dissipating. This, in a simplified sense, is the multiplier effect. An initial injection of spending, whether from government investment or consumer optimism, doesn't just have its immediate impact. It sets off a chain reaction. The recipient of that initial spending now has more income, and they spend a portion of it. That spending, in turn, becomes income for someone else, who also spends a fraction of it. And so on, creating a cascading wave of economic activity, larger than the initial pebble. This multiplier effect is a cornerstone of one particular economic perspective. A perspective that suggests, during times of economic downturn, the pond needs a little help to create those ripples. Now, consider the role of the policymaker. If demand is low, leading to unemployment and underutilized resources, what should be done? One vision encourages active intervention. The policymaker, armed with fiscal tools, government spending and taxation, can directly stimulate aggregate demand. Injecting spending into the economy, boosting consumption through tax cuts, all designed to nudge the economy towards full employment. This approach, born of the Great Depression, rests on the belief that markets are inherently prone to periods of instability. Left unchecked, the pond may remain stubbornly still, refusing to generate enough ripples to keep everyone afloat. Government intervention, therefore, is not just desirable, but necessary to restore equilibrium and alleviate human suffering. This is a world where coordination failures can trap economies in undesirable states, and thoughtful interventions provide a helpful boost. Now, let's consider another perspective. A perspective that views the pond not as a static entity, but as a complex, self-regulating ecosystem. In this view, the initial pebble, the economic disturbance, isn't necessarily a problem to be solved by outside intervention. The disturbances and recessions are seen as part of a natural process of adjustment, a cleansing fire that purges inefficient practices and reallocates resources to more productive uses. In this view, the pond has its own currents, its own internal mechanisms for self-correction. The classical economist argues that attempting to amplify the ripples artificially can distort the natural signals of the market. Artificially stimulating demand through government spending or artificially low interest rates can create imbalances, misallocate resources, and ultimately lead to even greater instability. Interventions can muddle the price signals which guide resource allocation, leading to malinvestment and bubbles. In this view, government should focus on maintaining a stable legal framework, protecting property rights, and ensuring sound money. The economy, left to its own devices, will eventually find its way back to equilibrium. These competing visions represent more than just different policy prescriptions. They reflect fundamentally different beliefs about the nature of markets and the role of government. One emphasizes the potential for market failures and the need for active intervention. The other stresses the inherent self-correcting mechanisms of markets and the dangers of government interference. The debate surrounding these perspectives continues to this day, informing discussions about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the overall role of government in the economy. The multiplier effect itself, while a powerful concept, is not without its critics. Some argue that the multiplier is often smaller in practice than in theory, due to factors such as leakages and the possibility that government spending may crowd out private investment. Understanding these competing visions, the strengths and weaknesses of each, is crucial for navigating the complexities of modern economic policy. It is understanding the subtle dance between interventions and letting systems work on their own. As we move forward, consider this. How do these competing visions of stabilization shape our understanding of the next great economic challenge? And what role should be played by the individuals trying to navigate and guide these economies? Liquidity preference and interest rate manipulation. We've traced the contours of economic instability, the inherent ebb and flow that threatens to capsize even the most robust-seeming ship of state. Now, let us turn to the levers of potential control, to the theoretical architectures designed to mitigate these turbulent tides. We arrive inevitably at the crux of a long-standing debate, a divergence of perspectives that shapes contemporary economic policy to this day. The clash between Keynesian and Hayekian thought, a conflict we can understand through their approaches to liquidity preference and interest rate manipulation. The heart of the matter lies in the nature of money itself. Is it merely a neutral veil, as the classical economist often argued, a passive instrument that simply reflects underlying real economic activity? Or does it possess an independent agency, a force capable of influencing the very dynamics it is meant to represent? Our protagonists diverge sharply on this point. Consider the concept of liquidity preference. For the Keynesian, liquidity, the ease with which an asset can be converted into cash, is paramount. During periods of uncertainty, individuals and firms tend to hoard cash, preferring the safety of immediate purchasing power to the risks of investment or consumption. This increased demand for liquidity drives up interest rates, the price of borrowing. Higher interest rates, in turn, stifle investment, exacerbating the economic downturn. The Keynesian sees this as a self-fulfilling prophecy of fear, a downward spiral fueled by pessimism and a lack of confidence. The policymaker, guided by Keynesian principles, might then intervene. If private demand for liquidity is excessive, the central bank can step in as a provider of last resort, injecting liquidity into the system by lowering interest rates. This expansionary monetary policy is intended to stimulate investment, boost aggregate demand, and break the cycle of fear. The idea is to prime the pump, to use government action to reignite the engine of economic growth. The expectation is that once confidence is restored, private investment will follow, and the government can gradually withdraw its intervention. The Hayekian perspective, however, offers a starkly different diagnosis and prescription. While acknowledging the importance of liquidity, the Hayekian places greater emphasis on the underlying real factors driving economic cycles. Misallocation of capital, unsustainable booms fueled by artificially low interest rates, and the inevitable bust that follows. For the Hayekian, artificially suppressing interest rates through monetary policy is not a cure, but rather a dangerous palliative. It masks the underlying distortions in the economy, encouraging malinvestment and setting the stage for an even more severe correction later on. The argument centers on the information conveyed by interest rates. For the Hayekian, interest rates are not merely a price, but a critical signal that guides resource allocation. They reflect the relative scarcity of capital and the time preferences of savers and investors. When interest rates are artificially lowered, this signal becomes distorted, leading to unsustainable investment projects that are ultimately doomed to fail. The resulting cluster of errors, as the Hayekian might call it, generates a waste of resources and a painful period of adjustment. The Hayekian would argue that attempting to fine-tune the economy through monetary policy is a form of hubris, an overestimation of our ability to understand and control complex systems. Instead, the Hayekian advocates for a more hands-off approach, allowing market forces to work their magic, even if it means enduring short-term pain. The belief is that a period of recession, while unpleasant, is necessary to cleanse the economy of its excesses and pave the way for a more sustainable recovery. The difference, then, is fundamental. The Keynesian sees interest rate manipulation as a tool to stabilize the economy and prevent unnecessary suffering. The Hayekian views it as a dangerous intervention that distorts market signals and ultimately makes matters worse. One seeks to manage the symptoms, the other to address the underlying causes. These competing visions represent a fundamental tension in economic thought: the balance between intervention and laissez-faire, the role of government in mitigating risk versus the power of free markets to self-correct. As we move forward, consider: how might new financial technologies influence these traditional views of liquidity, and which system, or blend of systems, is truly best equipped for the challenges of a rapidly changing world? The role of government spending in Keynesian theory, as we've traced the contours of economic thought, from the classical emphasis on self-regulating markets to the disruptions caused by the Great Depression, we now arrive at a pivotal juncture. The divergence between Keynesian and Hayekian perspectives particularly concerning the role of government spending. Tonight, we'll gently explore how the Keynesian school positions government spending as a crucial stabilization force, a counterweight to the volatile tides of market fluctuations. The classical economists, proponents of a laissez-faire approach, largely believed in the inherent stability of markets. They envisioned a natural tendency towards full employment, with wages and prices adjusting flexibly to maintain equilibrium. Recessions, in this view, were temporary deviations, self-correcting through the very mechanisms of supply and demand. Government intervention, they argued, often distorted these natural processes, creating inefficiencies and hindering the return to stability. Think of a perfectly balanced scale. Intervention, they warned, would only disrupt that balance, prolonging the disequilibrium. However, the prolonged hardship of the Great Depression challenged this optimistic view. The sheer scale and duration of the economic downturn seemed to defy the classical prediction of rapid self-correction. Here, Keynesian economics emerged, offering a radically different interpretation and, consequently, a contrasting policy prescription. At the heart of Keynesian theory lies the concept of aggregate demand. 1. This is the total demand for goods and services in an economy at a given price level. The Keynesian perspective suggests that fluctuations in aggregate demand are the primary drivers of economic cycles. When aggregate demand falls, perhaps due to a decline in consumer confidence, investment, or exports, the economy can enter a recession. Businesses reduce production, unemployment rises, and incomes fall, creating a downward spiral. Imagine a stream running low. The entire ecosystem suffers. The crucial point of departure from the classical view lies in the stickiness of wages and prices, particularly downwards. Keynes argued that wages in reality don't always adjust quickly and easily downwards in response to falling demand. This stickiness prevents the labor market from clearing, leading to persistent unemployment. Think of gears that resist turning freely. The economic engine stalls. It is here that government spending enters the frame as a deliberate and vital tool. If aggregate demand is insufficient to maintain full employment, the Keynesian approach advocates for government intervention to directly boost demand. This can be achieved through various forms of government spending, infrastructure projects, direct payments to individuals, or increased government consumption. The goal is to inject money into the economy, creating a multiplier effect. The initial government spending leads to increased income for those who receive it, who then spend a portion of that income, generating further demand and income, and so on. This is like throwing a pebble into a pond. The ripples spread far and wide. The Keynesian perspective envisions government spending as a necessary countercyclical policy. During recessions, when private sector spending is weak, the government should step in to fill the gap, preventing a deeper and more prolonged downturn. During periods of economic expansion, the government can reduce spending or even run a surplus, cooling down the economy and preventing inflation. A skilled helmsman adjusts the sails to navigate the changing winds. Contrast this with the Hayekian view, which emphasizes the importance of sound money and the role of prices in transmitting information throughout the economy. From the Hayekian perspective, government intervention, even with good intentions, can distort price signals, leading to malinvestments and ultimately exacerbating economic problems. They argued that artificial boosts to demand, like those created by government spending, can create unsustainable booms followed by inevitable busts. Imagine artificially inflating a balloon. It may appear larger initially, but the risk of a sudden rupture is ever present. The debate between Keynes and Hayek highlights a fundamental tension in economic thought: the balance between market efficiency and the potential for market failures. Keynesian economics emphasizes the active role of government in stabilizing the economy during periods of crisis, while Hayekian economics prioritizes the self-regulating power of markets and cautions against government intervention. Both perspectives offer valuable insights, and the optimal approach often depends on the specific circumstances and the severity of the economic challenges. As we consider these competing visions, a crucial question lingers. How do we effectively measure the impact of government spending, distinguishing between genuine stimulus and unintended consequences? What are the long-term effects of large-scale government intervention on economic growth and stability? We shall continue to explore this in our following lecture. Keynesian Revolution. Acceptance and implementation. We left our prior discussion contemplating the storm clouds gathering over the economic landscape. Now, we turn to the response, the attempted navigation of those turbulent waters, the ascendance of Keynesian economics and its practical application. It wasn't a simple, universally embraced transition. It was a contest, a delicate dance between competing philosophies, primarily epitomized by the contrasting visions of what we can, for simplicity, call the new economist versus the free market theorist. The free market theorist, steeped in the classical tradition, saw the economy as a self-regulating organism. Disruptions like recessions were akin to fevers, unpleasant, certainly, but ultimately self-correcting. Market forces, given time, would naturally restore equilibrium. The invisible hand, Adam Smith's enduring metaphor, was the guiding principle. Intervention in this view was akin to a clumsy doctor interfering with the body's innate healing process, potentially causing more harm than good. Wage and price flexibility were paramount. If wages fell during a downturn, businesses would hire more workers, and the economy would, eventually, right itself. The role of government was primarily to ensure the sanctity of contracts and maintain a stable monetary policy, not to actively manipulate the economy. Conversely, the new economist, observing the protracted suffering of the Great Depression, saw a fundamentally flawed system. The invisible hand, in his view, could sometimes fumble, leaving the economy stuck in a prolonged period of low demand and unemployment. The classical assumption of self-correction seemed cruelly inadequate in the face of widespread hardship. The essence of his argument was simple. Demand drives production. If people aren't buying goods and services, businesses won't produce them, and workers will lose their jobs. A downward spiral ensues, a vicious cycle of declining demand and rising unemployment. In such a scenario, the free market theorist's faith in automatic adjustment was, in his view, misplaced. A spark was needed to restart the engine. The spark, according to the new economist, was government intervention. By increasing government spending or cutting taxes, policymakers could inject demand into the economy, breaking the downward spiral. This fiscal stimulus would boost production, create jobs, and ultimately restore confidence in the marketplace. The government, therefore, had a positive responsibility to manage aggregate demand and smooth out the business cycle. This active role required careful monitoring, data analysis, and a willingness to use the tools of fiscal policy to steer the economy toward full employment. Imagine the economy as a large, complex machine. The free market theorist believed that it was best left to its own devices, occasionally needing a bit of oil to keep the gears turning smoothly. The new economist, on the other hand, saw the government as the engineer, capable of diagnosing problems and making necessary adjustments to keep the machine running optimally. This new perspective, however, wasn't immediately embraced. Many policymakers, deeply influenced by classical economics, were hesitant to abandon the principles of balanced budgets and minimal government intervention. The idea of deliberately running deficits to stimulate the economy was, for many, anathema. The early years of the Depression were characterized by a clinging to these classical prescriptions, often exacerbating the crisis. Yet, as the Depression dragged on and the human cost became unbearable, the new economist's ideas began to gain traction. The war years, with their massive government spending on defense, provided an unexpected testing ground for Keynesian principles. The wartime boom, fueled by government demand, seemed to validate the notion that government spending could indeed lift an economy out of a slump. This experience, coupled with the intellectual force of the new economist arguments, gradually shifted the balance of power. Post-war, governments around the world began to adopt Keynesian policies, embracing the idea of active economic management. Unemployment insurance, Social Security, and other welfare programs emerged as automatic stabilizers, providing a safety net for those who lost their jobs and helping to maintain demand during downturns. Central banks, armed with new tools, actively managed interest rates and the money supply to influence economic activity. The goal was to achieve a delicate balance, to maintain full employment without triggering inflation. This implementation of Keynesian policies marked a significant departure from the laissez-faire approach that had dominated economic thinking for generations. The government had become a key player in the economic arena, actively shaping the economic landscape. But this was only a phase. As the years passed, new challenges arose, challenging the dominance of the new economist framework. The question remained, could this carefully constructed system, built on the foundations of active government intervention, withstand the test of time, or would new crises expose its inherent weaknesses, leading to another paradigm shift? What happens when the engineer starts adjusting the machine a little too much? Chapter 21, World War II. Full employment through government control. Good evening. We've explored the turbulent decade of the 1930s, witnessing the failings of the classical economic paradigm under the crushing weight of the Great Depression. Tonight, we turn our gaze to the Second World War, a period of immense destruction, but also one that inadvertently provided a dramatic, albeit tragic, demonstration of a fundamentally different economic approach. It's a period where the theoretical debates simmering in academic circles were thrust onto the world stage, playing out in stark reality. The Great Depression, you see, exposed a fault line, a deep chasm in economic thought. On one side stood what we might call the classical economist. He believed in the self-correcting nature of markets. He argued that downturns were temporary and that government intervention would only distort the natural equilibrium, prolonging the suffering. Let the recession run its course, cleanse the system, and eventually, prosperity would return. Laissez-faire was the guiding principle, a hands-off approach predicated on the inherent stability of the free market. On the other side, a new perspective was emerging. A perspective emphasizing the potential for persistent unemployment, the possibility of a broken engine needing a jumpstart. This was the intellectual domain of what we might call the reformist. He argued that markets, left to their own devices, could become stuck in a low equilibrium trap. Aggregate demand, the total spending in the economy, could be insufficient to generate full employment. He advocated for government intervention, not to control the market, but to stimulate it, to nudge it back towards health. And then, the war came. The onset of World War II forced governments to undertake massive economic interventions. Suddenly, the very things that were previously deemed economically harmful, large budget deficits, heavy regulation, direct control over industries, became the norm. Governments commandeered resources, directed labor, and allocated materials with an unprecedented level of control. Factories that once produced consumer goods were retooled to manufacture tanks, planes, and ammunition. Millions of individuals were conscripted into the armed forces, effectively eliminating unemployment overnight. The results were undeniable. Economies that had languished in stagnation for years surged back to life. The Great Depression seemed to vanish, replaced by a boom driven by wartime production. This observation became a powerful argument in favor of the reformists' perspective. It seemed to prove that government spending could indeed stimulate aggregate demand, creating jobs and pulling economies out of recession. Full employment, a distant dream just a few years prior, became a tangible reality. However, this apparent success came at a tremendous cost. The wartime economy was not a free market. It was a command economy, driven by government directives rather than consumer preferences. Freedom of choice was curtailed, resources were misallocated, and the focus was solely on winning the war, regardless of economic efficiency. The question then becomes, can government intervention achieve full employment without sacrificing individual liberty and economic efficiency? Can the wartime model, with its heavy-handed control, be translated into a peacetime strategy without losing the essential benefits of a market economy? The classical economists would surely argue that the wartime economy was an aberration, a temporary deviation from the natural order. He would point to the sacrifices made in terms of individual freedom and economic efficiency as evidence of the inherent dangers of government intervention. And so, the war provided a dramatic, if brutal, test of competing economic philosophies. It demonstrated the potential of government spending to stimulate demand, but it also highlighted the risks of excessive control. It's a complex legacy, one that continues to shape economic debates to this day. As the war drew to a close, the central question was not whether government intervention could work, but how to transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime one, and what role the government should play in that new era. How could the lessons of the war be applied without replicating its authoritarian tendencies? That, dear listener, is the story we will begin to explore next time. Good night. End. Chapter 22. The Post-War Consensus. Keynesian dominance. The world, scarred and weary, sought stability. The laissez-faire approach, seemingly impotent in the face of massive unemployment and economic collapse, was largely discredited. Into this void stepped a new paradigm, one that promised active management and a more humane capitalism. This was the era of Keynesian dominance, a period where the ideas of interventionist economics held sway over policy decisions in much of the Western world. The core of this paradigm centered around the belief that aggregate demand, the total spending in an economy, was the primary driver of economic activity. When demand faltered, as it clearly had during the Depression, the economy could become trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of low output and high unemployment. The solution, according to the proponents of this view, was for the government to step in and stimulate demand, either through increased government spending or through tax cuts. This injection of spending would then ripple through the economy, creating jobs and boosting incomes, ultimately restoring full employment. Think of it as a carefully calibrated pump, priming the economic engine when it threatened to stall. The appeal of this approach was undeniable. It offered a practical, seemingly achievable path to economic stability and prosperity. It provided a framework for understanding and managing the business cycle, transforming economics from a purely observational science into a tool for active intervention. Governments embraced these ideas, implementing policies designed to smooth out economic fluctuations and maintain full employment. The fine-tuning of the economy became the ambition, a delicate balancing act between inflation and unemployment. However, even as this new orthodoxy took root, a counter-narrative simmered beneath the surface. This perspective, championed by a different set of thinkers, viewed the market as a complex, self-regulating system. They argued that government intervention, while perhaps well-intentioned, inevitably distorted market signals and created unintended consequences. The problem, they contended, was not a lack of aggregate demand, but rather distortions in the structure of production, caused by artificially low interest rates and misguided government policies. Imagine a carefully balanced ecosystem. Interfering with one element, no matter how noble the intention, can disrupt the entire system. These dissenting voices emphasized the importance of free markets, sound money, and limited government. They saw the price mechanism as a crucial source of information, guiding resource allocation and ensuring that production aligned with consumer preferences. Interventions, they argued, created malinvestments and unsustainable booms, ultimately leading to inevitable busts. The government's role, in their view, should be limited to enforcing contracts, protecting property rights, and maintaining a stable monetary environment. Think of it as a watchful guardian, protecting the integrity of the marketplace, but refraining from actively directing its course. Thus emerged a fundamental tension, a contest between competing visions of stabilization and the role of markets. On one side, a belief in the power of government intervention to manage aggregate demand and promote full employment. On the other, a conviction in the self-regulating capacity of free markets and the dangers of government interference. This tension, though often submerged beneath the surface of policy debates, would continue to shape the course of economic thought and policy for decades to come. The post-war consensus, however, largely sided with the first vision. Policymakers actively managed their economies, implementing fiscal and monetary policies designed to maintain full employment and promote economic growth. The social safety net expanded, providing a cushion against economic hardship. It was a period of unprecedented prosperity in many parts of the world, seemingly vindicating the new orthodoxy. The idea that booms and busts could be smoothed and that societies could avoid widespread suffering took firm hold. Yet the seeds of doubt were already sown. The success of the post-war consensus, while undeniable in many respects, masked underlying tensions and unresolved questions. Was this prosperity sustainable? Could the government truly fine-tune the economy without creating unintended consequences? Were the market's signals being distorted by well-meaning, but ultimately misguided, interventions? These questions would come to the fore as the economic landscape shifted once again, ushering in a new era of economic thought and policy. Chapter 23. The Bretton Woods system and managed exchange rates. Last time, we considered the tempestuous years of the Great Depression and the rise of unorthodox economic thinking. Tonight, let us shift our gaze to the aftermath, to the construction of a new economic order built on the lessons, both real and perceived, of those tumultuous times. This new order, born from the ashes of global instability, was christened the Bretton Woods system. Bretton Woods, more than just a place in New Hampshire, represented a specific philosophy regarding international monetary relations, a philosophy deeply intertwined with the ongoing debate between two titans of 20th century economic thought, Keynes and Hayek. While the Great Depression exposed the perceived failures of laissez-faire capitalism, the question remained: what was the appropriate role of government in stabilizing the economy, both domestically and internationally? The classical economist, long-reigning champion of unfettered markets, argued that government intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably distorted price signals and led to malinvestment. He believed that markets, left to their own devices, possessed an inherent self-correcting mechanism. Recessions, while painful, were necessary purges, cleansing the system of inefficiencies. Government intervention, in his view, only prolonged the agony and sowed the seeds for future crises. Conversely, the interventionist economist, haunted by the specter of mass unemployment and economic collapse, advocated for active government intervention to stabilize aggregate demand. He saw the market as a potentially unstable beast, prone to periods of prolonged stagnation. In his vision, the government, armed with fiscal and monetary policy tools, could act as a countervailing force, smoothing out the business cycle and preventing catastrophic downturns. The Bretton Woods system, in many ways, represented a compromise between these two seemingly irreconcilable visions. It acknowledged the need for international cooperation and a degree of stability in exchange rates, something the unmanaged gold standard of the pre-Depression era had demonstrably failed to provide. However, it also sought to preserve a significant degree of market freedom. The system was built around the US dollar, which was pegged to gold at a fixed rate. Other currencies, in turn, were pegged to the dollar. This created a network of relatively stable exchange rates, facilitating international trade and investment. Central banks were expected to intervene in foreign exchange markets to maintain these pegs, buying or selling their own currencies to keep them within a narrow band around the agreed-upon parity. However, the system was not entirely rigid. While exchange rates were fixed in the short term, countries were allowed to adjust their parities in cases of fundamental disequilibrium. This built-in flexibility was intended to prevent the kind of prolonged currency crises that had plagued the interwar period. A new institution, the International Monetary Fund, was created to oversee the system and provide financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments difficulties. Think of it as a finely tuned engine. The fixed exchange rates provided the framework, the solid chassis upon which international trade could flourish. The IMF acted as the mechanic, ready to step in and make adjustments when the engine started to sputter. The allowance for parity adjustments was the pressure release valve, preventing the system from exploding under excessive strain. The interventionist economist would have applauded the system's emphasis on international cooperation and its commitment to maintaining stability. The classical economist, while perhaps grudgingly acknowledging the benefits of reduced exchange rate volatility, would have remained wary of the potential for government manipulation and the inherent distortions of fixed exchange rates. He would have argued that the system, by suppressing market signals, could lead to imbalances and ultimately prove unsustainable. The Bretton Woods system, despite its initial success, was not without its flaws. The asymmetry inherent in the system, with the US dollar at its center, created unique challenges. The Triffin dilemma, for example, highlighted the inherent contradiction between the US providing sufficient dollars to meet global liquidity needs and maintaining the dollar's convertibility to gold. As the world economy grew, the demand for dollars increased, putting pressure on the U.S. gold reserves. The policymaker found himself walking a tightrope, balancing the needs of domestic economic stability with the requirements of international monetary order. Ultimately, the Bretton Woods system unraveled in the early 1970s, succumbing to the pressures of inflation, currency speculation, and the growing strains on the U.S. dollar. The era of fixed exchange rates gave way to a new era of managed floating exchange rates, a system that, in many ways, still governs the international monetary landscape today. However, the debate between the virtues of market freedom and the necessity of government intervention continues, a constant undercurrent in the ever-evolving story of economic thought. As we prepare to delve into the complexities of floating exchange rates and the rise of globalization, consider this. Did the managed exchange rates of Bretton Woods offer a balance that free-floating systems struggle to achieve, or were its inherent limitations ultimately its undoing? Chapter 24: The Rise of the Welfare State. Social safety nets. Having explored the tumultuous landscape of boom and bust cycles, our minds now naturally turn to the question: how can societies cushion themselves against such economic volatility? This chapter delves into the rise of the welfare state, a direct response to the perceived failures of purely laissez-faire capitalism. We will examine how it functions as a social safety net, drawing a crucial distinction between two influential, yet deeply contrasting, economic philosophies: the visions of stabilization and markets as championed by what we shall term the interventionist and the free market advocate. The Great Depression served as a crucible, forging new economic paradigms. The prevailing classical economist models, which advocated for minimal government intervention and self-correcting markets, seemed inadequate in the face of widespread unemployment and economic collapse. The system, in its elegant theoretical design, wasn't quite working as intended in reality. A tide was turning, slowly but steadily. The pendulum of economic thought began its swing towards greater government involvement. The interventionist, reacting to the stark realities of mass unemployment, argued for active government intervention to stabilize aggregate demand. His central idea, a powerful concept, was that government spending could fill the void left by decreased private investment and consumption during economic downturns. Borrowing to finance public works, employment programs, and direct relief would stimulate demand, creating a multiplier effect that would ripple through the economy, lifting it from the depths of recession. The welfare state, in this vision, was not merely a charitable endeavor, but a crucial tool for macroeconomic management. It was about injecting vitality into a sluggish economic heart. Imagine a riverbed, once fertile, now dry. The interventionist proposed building a dam, government spending, to regulate the flow of water, economic activity, ensuring a constant, albeit managed, supply to the fields downstream. The welfare state, in this context, became the irrigation system, directing resources where they were most needed to sustain life and growth. In stark contrast stood the free market advocate. He recognized the suffering caused by economic downturns but vehemently opposed large-scale government intervention. His concern centered on the unintended consequences of such policies. He believed that government spending, while seemingly beneficial in the short term, would inevitably lead to inflation, distorted market signals, and ultimately, a less efficient allocation of resources. He argued that the market, left to its own devices, would eventually correct itself, albeit perhaps painfully. He preferred targeted, minimal interventions to alleviate immediate suffering, while allowing the natural forces of supply and demand to restore equilibrium. He saw the interventionist's dam not as a savior, but as a barrier. He believed it would disrupt the natural flow of the river, causing imbalances upstream and downstream. He worried that government control over resource allocation would stifle innovation, hinder competition, and ultimately lead to a less prosperous society. The welfare state, as it evolved, represented a compromise, albeit an uneasy one, between these competing visions. Social security, unemployment insurance, and other forms of social assistance aimed to provide a safety net for those most vulnerable to economic shocks. Yet, the debate continued. and continues to this day, about the optimal size and scope of government intervention. How much is too much? How little is inadequate? The answers, predictably, are rarely clear-cut and often depend on prevailing economic conditions and societal values. Policymakers must constantly walk a tightrope, balancing the need for stability with the importance of market efficiency. The challenge lies in finding the delicate balance that maximizes societal well-being without stifling the engines of economic growth. The rise of the welfare state was not solely an economic phenomenon. It was also a reflection of shifting social attitudes. The concept of individual responsibility began to be tempered by a growing sense of collective responsibility. The idea that society had a moral obligation to care for its most vulnerable members gained traction. This shift in moral compass influenced the design and implementation of social safety nets, shaping them into institutions that aim not only to provide economic security, but also to promote social justice. The echoes of this debate continue to resonate in modern economic policy. The tension between stabilization and free markets remains a central theme in discussions about government spending, taxation, and regulation. As we move into the next phase of economic history, we find ourselves grappling with new challenges: globalization, technological disruption, and climate change that demand fresh perspectives on the role of the state in the economy. And so, as we prepare to explore these new horizons, we pause to consider a lingering question. Has the welfare state, in its current form, truly achieved the optimal balance between stability and freedom? Or are there still ways to refine its design and improve its effectiveness? That question will have to keep you thinking for the next chapter. Until then, rest peacefully. Chapter 25. The Chicago School. A counter-revolution emerges. We've traced the rising tide of Keynesian thought, its embrace by governments seeking to manage economic fluctuations. But tides, as we know, inevitably ebb. From the heartland of America, a new perspective, or rather, a revitalized older one, began to gather force. The Chicago School of Economics. It presented a starkly different vision of economic stability and the role of markets, setting the stage for a prolonged intellectual contest. Keynes versus Hayek, intervention versus laissez-faire. Recall the bedrock of Keynesian economics, the belief that aggregate demand, the total spending in an economy, could be managed by government action. When demand flagged, as during a recession, the policymaker could step in, increasing government spending or lowering taxes, injecting lifeblood back into the system. This, proponents argued, stabilized the economy, preventing the dangerous deflationary spirals and mass unemployment that characterized the Great Depression. It was a vision of active stewardship, a deliberate hand guiding the market towards equilibrium. The Chicago School, however, saw this active intervention as a dangerous overreach. They believed that markets, while imperfect, possessed a powerful self-correcting mechanism. This inherent resilience, they argued, was constantly being disrupted, not helped by government meddling. The unseen hand of the market, allowed to operate freely, would ultimately allocate resources efficiently and lead to sustainable growth. The key, therefore, wasn't to manage demand, but to create a stable and predictable environment in which businesses could invest and consumers could spend with confidence. At the heart of this disagreement lay fundamentally different views on the causes of economic instability. The Keynesian perspective often attributed downturns to a lack of aggregate demand, a failure of spending. The Chicago School, however, emphasized the role of monetary policy, the management of the money supply, as the primary driver of economic cycles. They argued that erratic changes in the money supply, often caused by government attempts to fine-tune the economy, were the real source of booms and busts. Stable monetary policy, they believed, was the key to stable economic growth. This difference in diagnosis led to drastically different prescriptions. Where the policymaker saw a need for fiscal stimulus during a recession, the Chicago School advocated for a steady, predictable monetary policy, allowing the market to naturally adjust. They worried that government spending, while perhaps providing a short-term boost, ultimately distorted the market, crowding out private investment and leading to unintended consequences. They envisioned a leaner government, focused on maintaining law and order, protecting property rights, and ensuring the stability of the currency. The intellectual roots of this counter-revolution stretched back to the classical economist, figures like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who emphasized the importance of free markets and limited government intervention. But the Chicago School wasn't simply a revival of classical thought. They developed sophisticated mathematical models and statistical techniques to support their arguments, grounding their ideas in rigorous empirical analysis. They championed the use of econometrics to test economic theories and to inform policy decisions. This quantitative approach lent credibility to their arguments and helped them gain influence within academic circles and eventually within the halls of power. Furthermore, the Chicago School placed great emphasis on individual rationality and the importance of incentives. They believed that people, acting in their own self-interest, would ultimately make the best decisions for themselves and for society as a whole. Government intervention, they argued, often distorted these incentives, leading to inefficient outcomes and unintended consequences. Free markets, on the other hand, provided a powerful mechanism for aligning individual incentives with the collective good. This perspective had profound implications for a wide range of economic issues, from antitrust policy to regulation to the role of government in providing social welfare. The Chicago School advocated for deregulation, lower taxes, and a smaller role for government in the economy. Their ideas, initially on the fringes of mainstream economics, began to gain traction in the 1970s as disillusionment with Keynesian policies grew. The stagflation of the decade, the combination of high inflation and slow economic growth, seemed to challenge the core tenets of Keynesian economics, creating an opening for alternative perspectives. It was a time of questioning, of reassessment, and of a growing receptiveness to the ideas of the Chicago School. Thus, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in economic thinking. The counter-revolution had begun. But how would these competing visions of stabilization and markets play out in the real world? Would the pendulum swing decisively away from intervention and towards laissez-faire? And what unforeseen consequences might such a shift entail? These questions would shape the economic landscape for decades to come. Chapter 27. Stagflation. In the 1970s, cracks in the Keynesian foundation, the post-war period, as we've discussed, largely embraced the teachings of Keynes. The policymaker was granted the power to steer the economic ship, to dampen the cycles of boom and bust through fiscal and monetary interventions. Governments could spend their way out of recessions, and central banks could adjust interest rates to manage inflation. This seemed to work, at least for a while. But the 1970s brought a storm that the Keynesian framework struggled to navigate: stagflation, the unwelcome combination of stagnant economic growth and rampant inflation. Imagine trying to push a car uphill while simultaneously pumping air into a leaking tire. The efforts feel futile, the progress minimal. Stagflation exposed deep fissures in the seemingly solid foundation of Keynesian economics. The prevailing wisdom held that inflation and unemployment were inversely related. This was the Phillips curve, a concept that suggested the policymaker could choose a point on the curve, accepting a certain level of inflation in exchange for lower unemployment, or vice versa. Stagflation shattered this notion. Suddenly, both inflation and unemployment were rising simultaneously. The compass of economic policy seemed to spin wildly. To understand this challenge, it's helpful to revisit the contrasting visions of economic stabilization held by Keynes and Hayek. Consider them as two architects, each offering blueprints for a stable and prosperous society. Keynes, focused on aggregate demand, believed that active government intervention was essential to keep the economy at full employment. He saw markets as prone to instability, liable to fall into prolonged slumps if left to their own devices. The policymaker, armed with fiscal and monetary tools, could step in to boost demand and restore equilibrium. Think of this as a gardener carefully pruning and watering plants to ensure a healthy and balanced garden. Hayek, on the other hand, championed the power of free markets. He viewed the market as a complex, self-regulating system that transmits information through prices. Inflation, in Hayek's view, was not simply a matter of insufficient demand, but a distortion of the price signals that guide resource allocation. Government intervention, especially monetary expansion, artificially suppressed interest rates, leading to malinvestment and unsustainable booms. These booms inevitably turned to busts, creating economic imbalances that could not be easily corrected by further government intervention. This is akin to a doctor who believes in allowing the body's natural healing processes to work, rather than constantly intervening with medication that might mask the underlying problem. The oil shocks of the 1970s, sudden and dramatic increases in the price of oil, served as a catalyst, exacerbating the underlying economic problems. These shocks simultaneously reduced aggregate supply and increased inflationary pressures. The policymaker, trained in the Keynesian tradition, responded with expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, attempting to stimulate demand and combat unemployment. However, these policies only fueled inflation, without addressing the underlying supply-side constraints. It was like pouring fuel onto a fire, hoping to put it out. Critics, echoing Hayek's concerns, argued that these interventions only worsened the situation by further distorting market signals and delaying the necessary adjustments. They advocated for deregulation, lower taxes, and a tighter monetary policy to bring inflation under control. This marked a turning point. The Keynesian consensus, once so dominant, began to lose its grip. The stagflation of the 1970s forced a reevaluation of economic thinking. The belief in the policymakers' ability to fine-tune the economy was shaken. The shortcomings of the Keynesian model became apparent, paving the way for new schools of thought that emphasized the role of supply-side factors, monetary policy, and the importance of free markets. The once smooth surface of economic theory was now cracked and fragmented, reflecting the complex and uncertain economic landscape. The river of economic thought, once flowing smoothly in one direction, began to divide into multiple streams. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and the intellectual landscape was forever altered. But the story doesn't end here. As the decade closed, a new wave of economic thinking was forming, promising a way out of the stagflationary wilderness. What shape would this new economic paradigm take, and how would it grapple with the lessons learned from the turbulent 1970s? That, my friend, is a question for another night. Chapter 28. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Warning against central planning. Welcome back. Last time, we explored the subtle shifts in economic thought following the war. Tonight, we turn to a particularly influential and often controversial voice from that era, Friedrich Hayek and his seminal work, The Road to Serfdom. This book, published in 1944, offered a stark counterpoint to the prevailing currents of thought which leaned heavily towards government intervention and central planning as solutions to the economic woes of the time. It stands as a powerful cautionary tale, a philosophical argument against the dangers of surrendering too much economic control to the state. We will now explore Hayek's arguments in the context of the Great Debate. Keynes versus Hayek, two competing visions of stabilization and markets. Hayek's central thesis revolves around the idea that central economic planning, however well-intentioned, inevitably leads to a loss of individual liberty and, ultimately, to totalitarianism. This might seem like a radical claim, but Hayek builds his argument on the inherent limitations of centralized knowledge. He posits that the economic system is far too complex for any single entity, be it a government agency or a committee of experts, to fully comprehend and manage effectively. Imagine the economy as a vast, intricate network, a flowing river delta with countless channels and tributaries. Each individual participant, each consumer, each producer, each entrepreneur, possesses unique knowledge about their specific circumstances, their preferences, and their capabilities. This knowledge is dispersed throughout the system, constantly shifting and evolving in response to changing conditions. The price mechanism, in Hayek's view, acts as a crucial signaling system, transmitting information about scarcity, demand, and opportunity across this vast network. Now, picture attempting to dam this river, to divert its flow according to a centrally planned blueprint. No matter how sophisticated the dam, no matter how advanced the engineering, it will inevitably disrupt the natural equilibrium of the system. It will create unintended consequences, distortions, and inefficiencies that are impossible to foresee or fully mitigate. The central planner, in attempting to impose order from above, inevitably stifles the spontaneous coordination that arises from the decentralized decisions of countless individuals. This is the core of Hayek's warning. This contrasts starkly with the vision offered by proponents of Keynesian economics. The policymaker, inspired by Keynes, sees a role for government intervention to stabilize the economy, to smooth out the booms and busts of the business cycle. Keynesian economics, while acknowledging the importance of markets, emphasizes the potential for market failures, especially during periods of recession or depression. In such times, the policymaker argues, government spending and monetary policy can be used to stimulate demand, to put idle resources back to work, and to restore confidence in the economy. This vision sees the government as a necessary counterbalance, actively steering the economic ship through turbulent waters. Hayek, however, remains deeply skeptical of the policymaker's ability to fine-tune the economy. He argues that such interventions, however well-intentioned, are likely to create more problems than they solve. He sees government spending as inherently inefficient, prone to political influence and bureaucratic inertia. He fears that attempts to manipulate interest rates and the money supply will distort price signals, leading to misallocation of resources and unsustainable booms that inevitably end in painful corrections. Furthermore, Hayek warns of the gradual erosion of individual freedom that can result from increasing government control over the economy. He argues that economic freedom is inextricably linked to political freedom, and that the more the state controls the means of production and distribution, the more power it wields over individuals' lives. This ultimately leads to a society where individuals are increasingly dependent on the state, and where dissent and independent thought are suppressed. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom is therefore not simply an economic treatise. It is a philosophical defense of individual liberty and a warning against the dangers of collectivism. It is a reminder that the pursuit of economic security should not come at the expense of freedom, and that the complexities of the economic system require humility and respect for the spontaneous order that emerges from decentralized decision-making. While the world moved towards intervention, Hayek offered a stark and necessary counterpoint. As we move forward, consider this. If central planning is indeed a road to serfdom, what alternative paths can lead to both economic prosperity and individual liberty? And how can we navigate the inherent tension between the need for stability and the dangers of excessive control? Chapter 29. The failure of wage and price controls. Last time, we considered the inherent complexities of coordinating economic activity in the face of shocks. Now, let's examine a tool often touted as a quick fix: wage and price controls, and why they so often falter, particularly when viewed through the contrasting lenses of Keynesian and Hayekian thought. Imagine a river, the economy, flowing steadily. A sudden dam, a crisis, disrupts this flow. The temptation is strong for the policymaker to step in, to directly manage the flow, setting specific levels, limiting the rise of certain currents, the fall of others. This is, in essence, the appeal of wage and price controls, a seemingly direct solution to perceived imbalances. The rationale often goes something like this: inflation is rampant, prices are spiraling out of control. By simply decreeing that prices cannot exceed a certain level, the policymaker hopes to curb inflation directly. Similarly, if wages are deemed too low, a minimum wage is imposed, a floor beneath which compensation cannot fall. The intent is often noble, a desire to protect the vulnerable and stabilize the system. However, the classical economist, deeply skeptical of such interventions, would raise a crucial objection. He would argue that prices and wages are not arbitrary numbers. They are signals, transmitting information about scarcity, demand, and the relative value of different goods and services. Artificially fixing these signals distorts the information they convey, leading to unintended and often undesirable consequences. The Hayekian perspective, in particular, highlights the distributed nature of economic knowledge. No single planner can possess the information necessary to set prices and wages accurately for the entire economy. It is a problem of knowledge, not merely of will. Consider a price ceiling imposed on, say, gasoline. If the market price, determined by supply and demand, is above this ceiling, then demand will naturally exceed supply. Suddenly, there's a shortage. Queues form at gas stations. Some individuals may be forced to go without. Resources are wasted as people spend valuable time searching for fuel. The market, unable to function openly, may be driven underground, creating a black market where gasoline is sold at inflated prices, benefiting only those willing to circumvent the law. The intended beneficiaries, the consumers, may find themselves worse off than before. Similarly, a minimum wage, intended to improve the lives of low-wage workers, can have the unintended consequence of reducing employment. If the minimum wage is set above the market clearing wage, some employers may find it unprofitable to hire as many workers as they previously did. The result can be increased unemployment, particularly among less skilled workers, the very group the minimum wage was meant to help. The economy, a complex ecosystem, is subtly reconfigured by this artificial stimulus. The Keynesian perspective, while more open to intervention than the Hayekian, also acknowledges the potential pitfalls of wage and price controls. The Keynesian emphasizes aggregate demand and the role of government in stabilizing fluctuations. While temporary controls might be considered in specific circumstances, such as during wartime, they are not seen as a long-term solution. A sustained imbalance between aggregate supply and demand will ultimately overwhelm any artificial price or wage fix. Instead, the Keynesian favors policies aimed at managing aggregate demand, such as fiscal or monetary stimulus. In essence, wage and price controls attempt to bypass the fundamental laws of supply and demand. They treat the symptoms of economic problems without addressing the underlying causes. They are akin to treating a fever with ice water, without addressing the infection causing the fever. The apparent immediate relief is often short-lived, and the long-term consequences can be far more damaging. The market, when allowed to function relatively freely, acts as a self-regulating mechanism. Prices and wages adjust to reflect changes in supply and demand, guiding resources to their most productive uses. While this process may not always be perfectly smooth or equitable, it is far more efficient and effective than any attempt to centrally plan the entire economy. The lesson, perhaps, is that intervention should be approached with humility and a deep understanding of the intricate workings of the economic system. As we move forward, we must consider how these lessons inform our understanding of the modern monetary system and the emerging landscape of digital currencies. How do these new forms of money fit into the ongoing debate about stabilization and market efficiency? The Volcker shock. Monetary policy tightening. Previously, we traced the contours of post-war economic thought, observing the ascendance of Keynesianism and its seeming triumph in managing the business cycle. But the smooth waters of interventionist policy were soon to encounter a rather turbulent current, a stark challenge that would reignite a long-standing debate. The fundamental question of stabilization: who should steer the economic ship, and how? This chapter delves into the Volcker shock, a pivotal moment in economic history that serves as a compelling case study in the competing visions of Keynes and Hayek. The 1970s, as you recall, were plagued by stagflation, a seemingly paradoxical combination of economic stagnation and high inflation. The Phillips curve, a cornerstone of Keynesian thinking, seemed to have broken down. Lowering unemployment appeared inextricably linked to escalating prices, a trade-off that left policymakers in a quandary. Traditional Keynesian solutions, involving fiscal stimulus and demand management, seemed only to exacerbate the inflationary pressures. Enter the policymaker, tasked with navigating these treacherous waters. He found himself facing a situation where the economy was adrift, confidence was waning, and the value of the currency was eroding. The prevailing Keynesian orthodoxy had seemingly failed to provide a viable solution. It was in this environment that the ideas of the Austrian economist, F.A. Hayek, began to gain renewed attention. Hayek, a longtime critic of Keynesianism, argued that government intervention, particularly through monetary policy, distorted the price signals that were essential for coordinating economic activity. For Hayek, inflation was not simply a matter of aggregate demand exceeding supply. It was a consequence of excessive credit creation by central banks, which artificially lowered interest rates and encouraged unsustainable investments. These investments, he argued, would eventually be revealed as malinvestments leading to a bust. The solution, therefore, was not to try to fine-tune the economy through fiscal or monetary policy, but to allow the market to self-correct. This brings us to the Volcker shock. The policymaker, recognizing the limitations of the Keynesian approach and the urgency of the situation, opted for a radical departure. He tightened monetary policy aggressively, driving up interest rates to unprecedented levels. This was a deliberate attempt to curb inflation, even at the cost of inducing a recession. The logic was that only by breaking the inflationary spiral could the economy be placed on a path of sustainable growth. The consequences were immediate and profound. The economy plunged into a deep recession. Unemployment soared. Businesses struggled to survive. The initial impact was undoubtedly painful, a period of sharp contraction, almost universally felt. However, the policymakers' gamble eventually paid off. Inflation, which had been raging out of control, was brought under control. The economy, after a period of adjustment, began to recover. Investment was stimulated, not by easy credit, but by a newfound confidence in the stability of prices. The Volcker shock is often cited as a victory for the Haykian perspective. It demonstrated that monetary policy, when used decisively to control inflation, could be effective, even if it meant short-term pain. However, it also highlighted the limitations of both Keynesian and Haykian approaches. The Keynesian framework, while useful in understanding demand-side fluctuations, struggled to explain and address the phenomenon of stagflation. The Haykian perspective, while offering a compelling explanation of the causes of inflation, provided limited guidance on how to manage the short-term consequences of monetary tightening. The Volcker shock was not a simple validation of one school of thought over another. It was a complex event with lasting implications, raising crucial questions about the role of government in the economy, the limitations of economic models, and the trade-offs between short-term pain and long-term stability. It forces us to consider the delicate balance between intervention and market forces, a balance that continues to shape economic policy today. The pendulum had swung, and the field of economics was forever altered. The memory of the Volcker shock continues to influence policy decisions, the long shadow of a sharp transition. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves, did this shift toward market-oriented policies represent a permanent change, or merely a temporary response to a unique set of circumstances? And how would these evolving ideas about stabilization navigate the increasingly complex globalized world of the decades to come? Chapter 31. Supply Side, Economics and Tax Cuts. Having explored the mechanics of government spending and its immediate impact on demand, our journey through the labyrinthine corridors of economic thought now turns to the opposing shore, the realm of supply. We've seen how stimulating demand can nudge an economy forward. But what if the key to prosperity lies not in priming the pump of demand, but in nurturing the wellspring of production itself? We've arrived at the point where the long shadow of supply-side economics falls. This school of thought, influential in shaping economic policy for decades, places its emphasis squarely on the producers, the entrepreneurs, and the innovators. The central tenet is elegantly simple. By reducing barriers to production, by fostering an environment conducive to investment and risk-taking, we unlock a wave of economic growth that benefits all. The most prominent manifestation of this philosophy is often found in policies centered around tax cuts. The underlying logic is a gentle cascade. Reduced taxes, particularly for businesses and high-income earners, are intended to spur investment. These individuals, freed from a larger tax burden, are presumed to channel their increased wealth into new ventures, expanding existing operations, and hiring more workers. This surge in production, in turn, would create more jobs, boost wages, and ultimately expand the overall tax base, offsetting the initial revenue loss from the tax cuts. This virtuous cycle, it's argued, leads to sustainable and broad-based prosperity. However, the waters of supply-side economics are not without their currents and eddies. One of the major debates, swirling around this approach, stems from the fundamental question of how incentives actually affect economic behavior. The Laffer curve, a graphical representation illustrating the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue, often enters the discussion. It proposes that at extremely high tax rates, reducing taxes can actually increase revenue by incentivizing greater economic activity. The crux of the matter lies in identifying the precise point on the curve where a tax cut translates into a revenue increase, and whether that point is realistically attainable. This brings us to a broader, more fundamental, intellectual rift, the Keynes versus Hayek debate, competing visions of stabilization and markets. On one side stands the legacy of Keynesian economics, emphasizing the government's role in managing aggregate demand to stabilize the economy, especially during downturns. Keynesians often argue that tax cuts, particularly for the wealthy, may not translate into significant investment, as they might simply be saved or invested abroad, offering only marginal impetus to domestic production. The focus remains on stimulating demand through direct government intervention and targeted tax relief for lower and middle-income earners, groups with a higher propensity to spend. On the other side, the tradition of Hayek emphasizes the self-regulating nature of markets and the dangers of government intervention. Adherents to this perspective see tax cuts as a means of liberating entrepreneurs and investors from the stifling hand of the state. Lower taxes, they argue, foster innovation, encourage risk-taking, and ultimately lead to a more efficient allocation of resources than government intervention could ever achieve. They are often wary of government attempts to fine-tune the economy, believing that these interventions inevitably distort market signals and lead to unintended consequences. These are not merely academic squabbles. They represent profoundly different views of how an economy functions and the appropriate role of government within it. They influence policy decisions related to taxation, regulation, and the overall structure of the economic landscape. The question of which approach is more effective, or indeed, whether a hybrid model drawing from both schools of thought offers the best path forward, continues to be a subject of intense debate. As we drift toward the next phase of our exploration, consider this. How do these competing economic philosophies navigate the complexities of a globalized economy, where capital flows freely across borders and supply chains span continents? Does the logic of supply-side economics hold equally true in an interconnected world, or does it require a reevaluation in the face of global economic realities? Chapter 32. The Reagan Era, Deregulation and Economic Growth, Following the Turbulent 70s, an era marked by stagflation and a deep sense of economic malaise. A new philosophy began to take hold. We left off examining the political undercurrents, and now we must consider the shifting intellectual tides that accompanied them, particularly the resurgence of a debate that had simmered for decades: the conflict between Keynesian and Hayekian approaches to economic management. At the heart of this debate lay fundamentally different understandings of how a market economy functions, especially in times of crisis. Imagine a garden, overgrown and struggling. One gardener, representing the Keynesian view, believes that the key is intervention. He believes in tending directly to the weak plants with fertilizer and heavy pruning. This corresponds to active fiscal policy, government spending, and tax cuts, designed to stimulate demand and pull the economy out of recession. This gardener believes the system needs a push, a jolt, to get it started again. Our other gardener, embodying the Hayekian perspective, sees the garden as a complex ecosystem. He believes interference, even with good intentions, can disrupt the natural balance. He advocates for a hands-off approach, believing that the market, left to its own devices, will eventually self-correct. Allow the soil to regenerate naturally, he argues. Let the sun do its work. This reflects a belief in deregulation, limited government intervention, and allowing prices to adjust freely to reveal the underlying realities of supply and demand. This gardener believes in patience, allowing the system to heal itself. The Keynesian approach, dominant for much of the post-war era, had lost some of its luster. The persistent inflation of the 1970s seemed resistant to traditional Keynesian remedies. The notion that government could fine-tune the economy, skillfully adjusting fiscal policy to maintain full employment and stable prices, began to seem overly optimistic. The machine wasn't responding in predictable ways. The incoming policymakers, influenced by thinkers who championed free markets and limited government, looked to Hayekian principles for guidance. Deregulation became a central plank of their economic agenda. Industries, burdened by what they considered excessive regulation, were freed from many government controls. The belief was that this would unleash entrepreneurial energy, promote innovation, and ultimately led to greater economic efficiency. Let the inherent powerful forces of the market move unimpeded. Tax cuts, particularly for corporations and high-income earners, were also implemented. The rationale was that lower taxes would incentivize investment and create jobs. This supply-side economics, as it came to be known, argued that stimulating production, rather than demand, was the key to long-term prosperity. It was a bet that lightening the load would allow the engine to run faster and smoother. The results of these policies were complex and hotly debated. Inflation did begin to fall, but at the cost of a significant recession in the early 1980s. Economic growth eventually rebounded, fueled by lower interest rates and increased investment. However, income inequality also increased, raising questions about who benefited most from this economic expansion. The question became, did the rising tide lift all boats, or just the yachts? The debate between Keynesian and Hayekian ideas continues to this day. It's a fundamental question about the role of government in a market economy, about the balance between intervention and laissez-faire. It speaks to the very core of our understanding of how societies create and distribute wealth. And as we prepare to consider the era of globalization and technological revolution that followed, we must ask ourselves, did this shift away from government intervention lay the groundwork for a new era of prosperity, or did it sow the seeds of future economic instability? The answer, as always, is likely somewhere in the complex interplay of forces that shape our world. We will have to consider this when we discuss the impact of technology on the market. Chapter 33. The Fall of the Soviet Union. Validation of free markets. We've explored the delicate dance of supply and demand, the intricate clockwork of individual choices. But these individual actions aggregate, flowing together to create the grand currents of economic history. Tonight, we turn our attention to one such colossal current, the fall of the Soviet Union. Did this event offer a resounding validation of free markets, and perhaps a definitive answer to the long-standing debate between the Keynesian and Hayekian perspectives? To understand the Soviet experience, we must first gently revisit the core tension between these two visions. The Keynesian approach, born from the crucible of the Great Depression, emphasizes the need for active government intervention to stabilize economies. It sees markets as inherently prone to fluctuations, needing the steadying hand of fiscal and monetary policy to smooth out the business cycle, to counteract what Keynes himself termed animal spirits. The policymaker, in this view, has a crucial role to play, calibrating spending and interest rates to maintain full employment and price stability. Hayek, on the other hand, saw such interventions as deeply problematic, even dangerous. He argued that markets are, in fact, the most efficient mechanisms for processing information and allocating resources. Prices, in his view, are not merely numbers. They are signals, transmitting vast amounts of tacit knowledge throughout the economy. Attempts by the policymaker to manipulate these signals inevitably distort them, leading to unintended consequences, malinvestment, and ultimately, economic stagnation. Central planning, in particular, was seen as a road to serfdom, both economically and politically. The Soviet Union, with its centrally planned economy, presented a seemingly perfect case study. For decades, the state controlled nearly all aspects of economic life: production quotas, prices, distribution channels. Initial successes, particularly in industrializing a largely agrarian society, seemed to offer a challenge to the free market orthodoxy. But over time, cracks began to appear in this seemingly monolithic structure. The absence of price signals meant that resources were often misallocated. Factories produced goods that nobody wanted, while essential items remained scarce. Innovation was stifled, as there was little incentive to improve efficiency or develop new products. The invisible hand of the market, so revered by the classical economist, was replaced by the heavy hand of the state, resulting in a system that was both inefficient and unresponsive to the needs of its citizens. Furthermore, the lack of economic freedom was inextricably linked to a lack of political freedom. Dissent was suppressed, and individual initiative was discouraged. The dream of a communist utopia, gradually morphed into a reality of shortages, bureaucracy, and repression. The very stabilization efforts of the Soviet state, designed to eliminate the cyclical volatility of capitalism, ironically led to a far more profound and enduring stagnation. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, therefore, appeared to many as a decisive victory for the free market perspective. The failure of central planning, juxtaposed against the relative prosperity of market-based economies, seemed to provide irrefutable evidence that Hayek was right all along. The visible hand of the policymaker, so trusted by the Keynesians, had ultimately choked the life out of the Soviet economy. However, such a conclusion might be too simplistic. The fall of the Soviet Union was a complex event, shaped by a multitude of factors, not just economic ones. Political repression, ethnic tensions, and the arms race with the United States all played a role. Moreover, the transition to a market economy in many former Soviet states was far from smooth, often accompanied by corruption, inequality, and economic hardship. And, crucially, the collapse of the Soviet Union does not necessarily invalidate the core principles of Keynesian economics. The need for government intervention to address market failures, to provide social safety nets, and to invest in public goods remains a subject of ongoing debate and policy experimentation in market economies around the world. The role of the policymaker, while perhaps more nuanced than Keynes initially envisioned, is still essential in navigating the complexities of modern capitalism. So, where does this leave us? Did the fall of the Soviet Union truly settle the Keynes versus Hayek debate? Or did it simply highlight the limitations of both extremes, suggesting a need for a more balanced and nuanced approach to economic policy, one that recognizes both the power of markets and the importance of government oversight? Perhaps the real question is not which vision is inherently superior, but rather how can we best harness the strengths of both to create a more just and prosperous world as we enter this new digital globalized era. The dot-com boom and bust, a new economic landscape having navigated the turbulent waters of globalization and technological advancement. We now arrive at a particularly intriguing period, the dot-com boom and bust of the late 1990s and early 2000s. This era not only unveiled the potent force of the internet economy, but also reignited a long-standing debate within the halls of economic thought, a debate centered on the fundamental roles of government intervention and free markets in maintaining economic stability. Our focus tonight is on understanding how this period illuminated the competing visions of stabilization and markets, the nuanced dance between what we might call the Keynesian and Hayekian perspectives. The dot-com boom, fueled by the promise of boundless opportunity in the nascent internet, saw a surge of investment in technology companies. Stock prices soared, often detached from underlying profitability. This exuberance, while exciting, presented a challenge to established economic thinking. The classical economist, with his emphasis on the self-correcting nature of markets, might have argued that this was a natural, albeit perhaps over-enthusiastic, adjustment to a new technological paradigm. He might have advocated for a hands-off approach, allowing market forces to sort the winners from the losers. However, the inherent instability of this speculative bubble revealed the limitations of purely laissez-faire approaches. The rapid ascent was followed by an equally precipitous decline. Companies vanished, fortunes were lost, and the broader economy felt the sting. This is where the vision of the policymaker, drawing upon Keynesian principles, offered a different perspective. He might argue that during periods of irrational exuberance, markets are prone to instability. Active intervention, through fiscal and monetary policy, becomes necessary to manage the boom, to temper the speculative frenzy, and to soften the inevitable landing. Perhaps some strategic investments in infrastructure or more prudent regulation of IPOs could have mitigated the intensity of the bust. But the Hayekian counter-argument, even in this context, held its ground. He would suggest that even well-intentioned intervention distorts price signals, creating artificial incentives and ultimately hindering the efficient allocation of resources. He might argue that attempts to manage the dot-com bubble would have merely prolonged the inevitable correction, potentially making it even more painful. The problem, from his viewpoint, wasn't the volatility of the market, but rather the distortions introduced by earlier, perhaps well-meaning, attempts at economic fine-tuning. Consider the delicate analogy of a river. The Keynesian approach might be likened to building dams and canals to control the flow, preventing floods and ensuring a steady supply of water. But these structures, while providing stability, can also disrupt the natural ecosystem, diverting the river from its natural course. The Hayekian perspective, on the other hand, advocates for allowing the river to flow freely, trusting in its natural capacity to find its own equilibrium. Occasionally, there may be floods or droughts, but these are seen as natural consequences of a dynamic system, necessary for long-term health and resilience. The challenge, of course, is determining when intervention is truly necessary, and when it merely creates unintended consequences. The dot-com bust served as a poignant reminder of the cyclical nature of economic activity and the enduring tension between these competing visions. It illustrated the seductive allure of speculative bubbles and the inherent difficulty of predicting market behavior. More importantly, it underscored the importance of understanding the potential trade-offs between intervention and laissez-faire, between stability and dynamism. The market's efficiency is not merely about individual transactions, but also about the systemic implications of incentives, both natural and artificially created. Was the bust inevitable? Was there a middle ground, a way to harness the dynamism of the market while mitigating the risks of excess? These are questions that continue to resonate. As we transition from this period into the subsequent era of globalization's acceleration and the rise of new economic powerhouses, we must carry these lessons with us. The debate between these economic philosophies remains at the heart of policy decisions, and the echoes of the dot-com era still reverberate in our understanding of market stability and the appropriate role of government. What new challenges will arise in the next economic landscape, and how will these competing visions shape our response? Chapter 35. The 2008 Financial Crisis. A systemic failure? Welcome back. Last time, we considered the gradual emergence of increasingly complex financial instruments. Tonight, our focus shifts to a crucible in which those instruments and the very philosophies that underpin them were tested. The 2008 Financial Crisis. A moment, perhaps, where we can weigh the competing visions of stabilization and markets offered by Keynes and Hayek. It was a time when the debate between intervention and laissez-faire became less theoretical and more immediate. The 2008 crisis wasn't a singular event, but rather the culmination of years of accumulated imbalances. Think of it as a river, slowly gathering sediment and pressure until it breaches its banks. Low interest rates, fueled by a global savings glut, encourage borrowing. The proliferation of complex mortgage-backed securities, rated as safe havens when, in reality, they concealed pockets of risk, created an illusion of stability. Lending standards loosened, and the housing bubble inflated, encouraged by the belief that prices could only ever go up. It was a delicate ecosystem, built on fragile foundations. The core of the Keynesian argument centered on the necessity of government intervention to stabilize the economy during downturns. For the Keynesian economists, the failure to adequately regulate financial markets and to inject sufficient demand into the economy during the crisis exacerbated the problem. He would have seen the crisis as a failure of aggregate demand. When asset values plummeted, consumer confidence evaporated, and businesses curtailed investment. The traditional Keynesian prescription was clear: increase government spending to offset the decline in private spending, stimulate demand, and prevent a deeper recession or even a depression. It was about priming the pump, about jump-starting the engine. Conversely, the Hayekian economist viewed the crisis as a consequence of previous interventions, particularly artificially low interest rates set by central banks. These low rates, according to Hayek, distorted price signals, leading to malinvestment and the unsustainable housing bubble. For him, the crisis was not a failure of the market, but a failure of the government to allow the market to correct itself. Bailouts and stimulus packages, in this view, only prolonged the inevitable and delayed the necessary reallocation of resources. The Hayekian solution emphasized allowing the market to cleanse itself, accepting short-term pain for long-term gain. It was about letting the system find its natural equilibrium, even if that process was initially painful. The response to the 28 crisis was a complex blend of both Keynesian and Hayekian principles. Massive government bailouts were implemented to stabilize the financial system, preventing a complete collapse. The policymakers saw this as a necessary evil, preventing a run on the banks and protecting the broader economy. These actions, broadly Keynesian in spirit, were designed to prevent a catastrophic downward spiral. Interest rates were slashed to near zero, and quantitative easing programs were launched to inject liquidity into the market. However, there were also elements that aligned with the Hayekian perspective. The idea of creative destruction, allowing failing institutions to collapse and inefficient industries to restructure, was also implicitly present, although it was often overshadowed by the urgency of preventing systemic collapse. It was a tightrope walk, balancing the need for immediate intervention with the potential for unintended consequences. The debate centered on the degree and duration of intervention, and the potential for moral hazard, the incentive for institutions to take excessive risks, knowing they would be bailed out. Ultimately, the 2008 crisis highlighted the inherent tensions between these two schools of thought. Did the interventions prevent a full-blown depression? Or did they merely postpone the inevitable correction and sow the seeds for future crises? The answer, as is often the case in economics, is likely somewhere in between. The crisis exposed the fragility of complex financial systems and the limitations of both government intervention and unfettered markets. It forced us to re-examine the role of regulation, the nature of risk, and the importance of understanding the unintended consequences of our actions. The crisis served as a profound lesson in the interconnectedness of the global economy. Looking back, the 2008 crisis presents us with a lingering question. Did the response truly address the underlying causes of the crisis, or did it simply lay the groundwork for a new set of challenges in the decade to follow? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding the next great shift in economic thought, a move towards, well, we'll explore that next time. Good night. Keynesian responses to the crisis, bailouts, and stimulus. Welcome back. Last time, we examined the early warning signs that preceded the global financial crisis, those tremors beneath the surface that hinted at the earthquake to come. Tonight, we turn our attention to the immediate aftermath and the policy responses enacted to mitigate the damage. We will be focusing on a specific philosophical divide, a tension in economic thought that truly sharpened during this period. Keynes versus Hayek, competing visions of stabilization and the role of market. The crisis, as it unfolded, presented a stark choice to the policymaker. On one hand, there was the path advocated by what we might call the Austrian economist, a philosophy rooted in the belief that markets, left unfettered, are the best mechanism for allocating resources and correcting imbalances. According to this view, intervention, even during a crisis, distorts the market, creating unintended consequences and ultimately prolonging the pain. Let the system purge itself, they argued. Let the inefficient firms fail. Let the malinvestments unwind, and allow the market to find its natural equilibrium. This, they believed, was the only path to sustainable, long-term recovery. On the other hand, stood the proponents of what we shall call the Keynesian economist, who believed that during periods of extreme economic distress, active government intervention is not only justified, but absolutely necessary. The Keynesian perspective highlights the potential for a self-reinforcing downward spiral. As firms fail and unemployment rises, aggregate demand collapses, leading to further business closures and even greater job losses. This creates a negative feedback loop, trapping the economy in a state of prolonged stagnation. The Keynesian solution, then, involved two primary tools: bailouts and stimulus. Bailouts aim to prevent systemic collapse by providing financial assistance to failing institutions, particularly banks. The rationale was simple. If the banks failed, the entire financial system would grind to a halt, crippling credit markets and choking off the flow of capital needed for economic activity. The policymaker thus aimed to preserve the integrity of the financial system by injecting liquidity and capital into these institutions. Think of it as a carefully calibrated transfusion, designed to stabilize the patient, not necessarily cure the underlying disease. Stimulus, on the other hand, focused on boosting aggregate demand. This typically involved increased government spending on infrastructure projects, tax cuts designed to encourage consumption, and other measures intended to put money directly into the hands of consumers and businesses. The goal was to break the negative feedback loop of declining demand and rising unemployment. The idea was to kickstart the economy, creating a virtuous cycle of increased production, job creation, and rising incomes. It's akin to jump-starting a stalled engine, providing the initial spark needed to get things moving again. Both bailouts and stimulus were controversial. Critics of bailouts argued that they rewarded irresponsible behavior, creating a moral hazard. They argued that by rescuing failing institutions, the policymaker effectively incentivized excessive risk-taking in the future. Why should firms be cautious if they knew they would be bailed out if things went wrong? Critics of stimulus argued that it was wasteful and ineffective, that government spending inevitably leads to inefficient allocation of resources, and that the benefits are often outweighed by the costs. The classical economist feared the debt burden and the long-term consequences of such interventions. The policymaker, faced with the urgency of the situation, largely embraced a Keynesian approach. The rationale was that the risks of inaction were far greater than the risks of intervention. The potential for a complete economic meltdown, with widespread bank failures and mass unemployment, was simply too great to ignore. The short-term pain of bailouts and stimulus, while significant, was seen as a necessary price to pay to avert a catastrophic collapse. The consequences of these actions are still debated today. Did the bailouts prevent a complete financial meltdown? Did the stimulus measures effectively boost aggregate demand? Did these interventions create unintended consequences that will plague the economy for years to come? These are complex questions with no easy answers. What is clear, however, is that the crisis forced a reckoning between competing economic philosophies, and that the choices made during this period continue to shape our economic landscape. And as we move into the recovery phase, one cannot help but wonder, to what extent did these interventions merely postpone the inevitable correction, and what structural reforms are truly necessary for long-term sustainable growth? That is the question that will guide our discussion next time. Austerity measures, alternative approaches to recovery. Tonight, we'll turn our attention to a central debate in economic thought, a perennial tension, really, concerning the most effective strategies for economic stabilization and the role of markets. It's often summarized as the Keynes versus Hayek debate, though reducing these complex philosophies to mere labels doesn't quite capture the nuance. Instead, let's frame it as competing visions. One emphasizes the guiding hand of intervention, the other, the self-correcting power of the market. The debate often surfaces most acutely during periods of economic downturn. A recession, you see, presents a fundamental question. Should the government actively intervene to stimulate demand? Or should it stand back and allow the market to find its own equilibrium, even if that equilibrium involves a period of hardship and contraction? The interventionist approach, often associated with what we might call the modern school of economics, views recessions as failures of aggregate demand. When businesses aren't selling goods and services, they reduce production, leading to layoffs and further reductions in demand. This creates a vicious cycle. The solution, according to this view, is for the government to step in and boost demand through increased spending or tax cuts. This fiscal stimulus acts as a kind of economic jumpstart, encouraging businesses to invest and hire, breaking the downward spiral. Think of it as adding water to a struggling pump, priming the system to get it flowing again. The logic is that by increasing overall demand, the government can create a multiplier effect, where each dollar spent generates more than a dollar in economic activity. Infrastructure projects, for instance, not only create jobs directly, but also stimulate demand for materials and services throughout the economy. Now, let's consider the opposing view, often championed by those aligned with the Austrian school. This perspective emphasizes the importance of sound money, limited government, and free markets. Proponents argue that recessions are not simply random events, but rather necessary corrections to prior misallocations of resources. They believe that artificial stimulus, while providing temporary relief, only postpones the inevitable adjustment and can even exacerbate the problem in the long run. The argument hinges on the concept of malinvestment. Imagine an economy where interest rates are artificially low, perhaps due to central bank intervention. This encourages businesses to invest in projects that may not be truly viable in the long term. When the artificial stimulus is removed, these malinvestments are exposed, leading to a period of painful but necessary liquidation. Austerity measures, then, are not seen as a cause of suffering, but as a way to allow the market to cleanse itself of these distortions. This involves cutting government spending, reducing regulation, and allowing prices to adjust to their natural levels. The idea is to create a more stable and sustainable foundation for future growth, even if it means enduring short-term pain. The classical economist, favoring this market-led approach, might suggest that government spending crowds out private investment, diverting resources from more productive uses. They might also argue that high levels of debt can lead to higher interest rates, making it more difficult for businesses to borrow and invest. The policymaker in this framework is more of a referee, ensuring fair play and protecting property rights, rather than an active player on the economic field. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. Both approaches have their strengths and weaknesses. The effectiveness of fiscal stimulus depends on various factors, including the timing, the size of the stimulus, and the overall state of the economy. Similarly, the success of austerity measures depends on the degree of economic flexibility and the ability of businesses and workers to adapt to changing conditions. The debate is not merely academic. It has real-world consequences for policy decisions, impacting everything from government spending to interest rates to regulatory policies. Understanding these competing visions is crucial for navigating the complexities of modern economic management. It's a balancing act, a continuous recalibration of forces aimed at fostering both stability and growth. Quantitative easing, uncharted monetary territory. We've examined the familiar dance of interest rates, the levers central banks traditionally pull to guide the economic ship. But what happens when those levers can no longer reach? When interest rates, having kissed the floor of zero, offer no further purchase? It is then that monetary policy ventures into uncharted waters, into a realm dominated by the strategy of quantitative easing, or QE. And as we consider this evolution, we must also recall the enduring debate, the philosophical current that shapes our understanding of economic stabilization, the competing visions of Keynes and Hayek. QE, in essence, is a direct infusion of liquidity into the financial system. Instead of lowering interest rates, the central bank directly purchases assets, typically government bonds, but sometimes even corporate debt. This action aims to lower long-term interest rates, encourage lending, and boost asset prices. The goal is to stimulate economic activity by making it cheaper for businesses and individuals to borrow and invest. Think of it as a carefully calibrated, systemic blood transfusion for an economy struggling to circulate capital. The implementation of QE reveals a deep fault line, reflecting the enduring Keynes versus Hayek tension. The Keynesian perspective, often guiding the policymaker, sees the economy as prone to periods of prolonged underemployment. During these times, animal spirits are dampened and aggregate demand falters. The Keynesian approach prioritizes active intervention to reignite demand and steer the economy toward full employment. QE, in this view, is a necessary tool, a bold attempt to break the chains of a liquidity trap. The rationale unfolds as follows. By purchasing assets, the central bank increases the money supply, which should encourage banks to lend more freely. Higher asset prices create a wealth effect, increasing consumer spending. Lower long-term interest rates reduce borrowing costs for businesses, incentivizing investment. In short, QE is a forceful injection of stimulus designed to jumpstart a sluggish economy. It is akin to a skilled physician applying pressure to key points, hoping to restore circulation and vitality. However, the classical economist, echoing the Hayekian perspective, views QE with deep skepticism, even apprehension. This school of thought emphasizes the importance of market signals and the potential dangers of distorting those signals through artificial interventions. They argue that QE creates moral hazard, encouraging excessive risk-taking by banks and investors who believe the central bank will always be there to backstop the market. Further, The classical economist suggests that QE can lead to inflation. While the increased money supply might not immediately translate into rising prices, it creates the potential for future inflation once the economy recovers. And perhaps even more concerning, QE can distort the allocation of capital, leading to malinvestment and ultimately undermining long-term economic growth. Resources are drawn away from where the market truly demands them, creating unsustainable bubbles. It is akin to forcing a river to change its course, inevitably leading to erosion and unforeseen consequences. The crux of the debate, then, boils down to the role of government intervention. The Keynesian view embraces it as a necessary tool for stabilizing the economy and correcting market failures. The Hayekian view cautions against it, emphasizing the importance of free markets and the potential dangers of unintended consequences. Both perspectives offer valuable insights, reminding us that economic policy is rarely a simple matter of choosing between right and wrong. It is often a delicate balancing act, a nuanced navigation of complex systems with inherent uncertainties. The use of QE has generated a vast amount of empirical data, yet the debate continues. Some studies suggest it has been effective in lowering long-term interest rates and boosting asset prices, while others find little evidence of a significant impact on economic growth. The long-term consequences of QE, particularly in terms of inflation and financial stability, remain a subject of ongoing debate. Did it truly stimulate growth, or did it just postpone inevitable corrections? As we move forward, the crucial question remains: what are the true, long-term ramifications of unconventional monetary policies like quantitative easing? How do we reconcile the immediate need for stabilization with the potential for future distortions and unintended consequences? The search for a balanced approach, a synthesis of these competing visions, continues to shape the future of economic policy. And as we close this chapter, we're left to ponder: how will the unwinding of these unprecedented policies reshape the economic landscape? Chapter 39. The Rise of Inequality, a Consequence of Globalization. We previously traced the accelerating currents of globalization, observing its disruptive yet undeniably transformative influence on international trade and capital flows. Now, let's turn our attention to a more somber consequence frequently attributed, rightly or wrongly, to this very phenomenon: the rise of economic inequality. To understand this, we must revisit a foundational debate that continues to shape our understanding of markets and the role of government. The competing visions of stabilization offered by the Keynesian and Hayekian schools of thought. Imagine the economic landscape as a vast and complex ecosystem. In this ecosystem, the classical economist, a staunch believer in the self-regulating power of the market, sees a natural tendency towards equilibrium. Recessions, in their view, are merely temporary imbalances, akin to a seasonal drought. The market, left to its own devices, will eventually find its way back to a state of full employment and efficient resource allocation. Any intervention, like artificially watering the crops, only distorts the natural order and ultimately prolongs the correction. Enter the Keynesian perspective, a counterpoint born from the ashes of the Great Depression. The Keynesian economist argues that markets, left unchecked, can become trapped in periods of prolonged stagnation, akin to a frozen lake unable to thaw itself. Animal spirits, the psychological drivers of investment, can plummet, leading to a self-reinforcing cycle of declining demand and unemployment. In this scenario, government intervention, through fiscal stimulus or monetary policy, becomes crucial to thaw the frozen lake and restore the flow of economic activity. Now, consider the role of globalization in this debate. As barriers to trade and capital flow diminished, firms increasingly sought out locations with lower labor costs, often in developing nations. This created a downward pressure on wages in developed countries, particularly for those with lower skills, contributing to a widening gap between the rich and the poor. The classical economist might argue that this is simply a reallocation of resources towards greater efficiency, benefiting consumers through lower prices and ultimately leading to long-term growth. The pain felt by some workers is a necessary, albeit unfortunate, consequence of this process. The Keynesian economist, on the other hand, would likely point to the potential for underconsumption as wages stagnate for a significant portion of the population. This underconsumption, fueled by rising inequality, could depress aggregate demand, hindering long-term growth and potentially leading to economic instability. In this view, government intervention, through progressive taxation, social safety nets, and investments in education and retraining, is necessary to mitigate the negative effects of globalization and ensure a more equitable distribution of its benefits. It's important to recognize that both perspectives offer valuable insights. The classical economist highlights the importance of market efficiency and the dangers of excessive government intervention, which can lead to unintended consequences and distort incentives. The Keynesian economist, on the other hand, reminds us that markets are not always self-correcting, and that government intervention can play a crucial role in stabilizing the economy and promoting social welfare. The challenge lies in finding the right balance, a point of equilibrium where the benefits of globalization can be harnessed while mitigating its negative consequences. The policymaker, attempting to steer the ship of state, must navigate these treacherous currents. The rise of inequality, therefore, presents a complex puzzle. Is it an inevitable consequence of globalization, a necessary price to pay for increased efficiency and economic growth? Or is it a symptom of policy failures, a result of inadequate social safety nets, and a lack of investment in education and skills? These questions continue to resonate in policy circles and academic debates around the world. As we move forward, we must also consider how technological advancements are reshaping the economic landscape and what this means for the distribution of wealth in the digital age. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. Chapter 40. Modern Monetary Theory. A new Keynesian frontier. We've seen how the tension between competing schools of thought, particularly the enduring debate between Keynes and Hayek, shapes our understanding of economic stability. One advocating for intervention to smooth the rough edges of the business cycle, the other warning against the unintended consequences of distorting price signals. Now, let us consider a more recent entrant into this arena: modern monetary theory, or MMT. It presents a distinctive lens through which to view the role of government spending, taxation, and the very nature of money itself. At its core, MMT challenges conventional wisdom about government debt. It posits that a sovereign nation, one which issues its own currency and doesn't peg its currency to another, cannot truly go bankrupt in its own currency. This is a provocative claim, indeed. The theoretical underpinning rests on the government's ability to create money. Just as a referee creates points in a game, so too can a sovereign government create the money it needs. Of course, the crucial question then becomes, what are the limits? If a government can always print money, why not simply fund all desired projects, eliminate poverty, and usher in an era of unparalleled prosperity? This is where the concept of real resources enters the picture. While a government can create money, it cannot create real goods and services. MMT argues that the true constraint on government spending is not a budgetary one, but rather the availability of these real resources: labor, raw materials, productive capacity. Inflation, then, becomes the key indicator. Excessive government spending, unchecked by taxation or other mechanisms to absorb excess liquidity, leads to too much money chasing too few goods. This pushes prices upwards, eroding purchasing power and potentially destabilizing the economy. In this framework, taxation is not primarily about funding government expenditures, but rather about managing aggregate demand and controlling inflation. Think of taxation as a siphon, drawing off excess liquidity from the economic system. MMT proponents advocate for policies like a job guarantee program. This program acts as an automatic stabilizer, providing employment to anyone willing and able to work at a publicly set wage. During recessions, when private sector employment declines, the job guarantee absorbs excess labor, preventing widespread unemployment and its associated social costs. As the economy recovers and private sector hiring picks up, workers transition out of the job guarantee, reducing the program's size and moderating inflationary pressures. However, MMT is not without its critics. Concerns about the potential for inflation are paramount. Skeptics argue that governments, even with the best intentions, may struggle to accurately gauge the economy's capacity and calibrate spending and taxation accordingly. The temptation to overspend, particularly during periods of political pressure, could prove irresistible, leading to runaway inflation and economic chaos. There are also concerns about the potential for political manipulation of the currency and the impact on central bank independence. The classical economist, ever wary of government intervention, would likely raise familiar objections. The artificial manipulation of interest rates and credit allocation, they would argue, will inevitably distort market signals, leading to malinvestment and ultimately hindering long-term economic growth. They might point to historical examples of hyperinflation as cautionary tales, demonstrating the dangers of unchecked monetary expansion. The policymaker, caught between competing demands and facing the realities of political constraints, would likely approach MMT with a degree of cautious skepticism. While the promise of fiscal flexibility is appealing, the risks of inflation and the potential for political abuse cannot be ignored. Thorough empirical research and careful modeling are essential before implementing such radical policies. MMT, therefore, represents a significant departure from both traditional Keynesianism and classical economics. It offers a fresh perspective on the relationship between government, money, and the economy. Whether it represents a genuine path to sustainable prosperity or a dangerous experiment with potentially disastrous consequences remains to be seen. Its theories are still evolving, and its real-world application is limited. The discourse surrounding it highlights the ongoing quest to understand the complex interplay of economic forces and to find the elusive balance between market freedom and government intervention. The debate over government debt and deficits. We've gently navigated the turbulent waters of monetary policy, observing how central banks attempt to fine-tune the economic engine. Now let's turn our attention to the parallel, yet often intertwined, realm of fiscal policy, specifically the swirling debate surrounding government debt and deficits. This is where the intellectual rivers of Keynesian and Aykian thought converge, diverge, and occasionally collide. The fundamental question at the heart of this discourse is simple, yet profoundly complex. What role should government play in stabilizing the economy, particularly during periods of recession or boom? The answer, naturally, is far from straightforward, dependent as it is on a tapestry of assumptions, priorities, and estimations about human behavior and market dynamics. The Keynesian perspective, born from the ashes of the Great Depression, advocates for active government intervention. Imagine the economy as a delicately balanced ecosystem. When a shock occurs, a sudden drop in demand, for example, the system risks spiraling into a negative feedback loop. Businesses cut production, workers lose jobs, and consumer spending further declines, exacerbating the initial problem. The policymaker, armed with the tools of fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, can act as a countervailing force. By increasing spending or cutting taxes, the government injects demand into the economy, stimulating activity and preventing a deeper recession. This injection often results in a budget deficit, as government spending exceeds tax revenue, increasing the national debt. However, the Keynesian philosopher argues that this debt is a necessary evil, a temporary sacrifice to avoid a far greater calamity. The debt, in this view, is an investment in future prosperity, as it prevents the economy from collapsing and allows it to recover and grow. Conversely, the Austrian economist views government debt and deficits with deep suspicion. He sees the market as a self-regulating organism, capable of correcting its own imbalances. Government intervention, in his view, is akin to throwing sand into the gears of a finely tuned machine. By artificially stimulating demand, the policymaker distorts market signals, leading to malinvestment and unsustainable booms. Resources are diverted to projects that would not be viable under normal market conditions, creating bubbles that inevitably burst. Furthermore, the Austrian economist argues that government debt represents a future burden on taxpayers, crowding out private investment and hindering long-term economic growth. The debt, in this perspective, is not an investment, but a deferred cost that will ultimately stifle innovation and prosperity. Consider the analogy of a river. The Keynesian approach is akin to building dams and reservoirs to control the flow of water, preventing floods and droughts. The Hayekian approach, on the other hand, prefers to let the river flow freely, believing that it will naturally find its own course. Both approaches have their merits and their limitations. The Keynesian approach can be effective in mitigating short-term economic crises, but it also carries the risk of creating long-term debt and distorting market signals. The Hayekian approach can promote long-term efficiency and innovation, but it may also be slow to respond to sudden shocks and may lead to periods of prolonged economic hardship. The reality, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between these two extremes. The optimal level of government debt and deficits depends on a variety of factors, including the state of the economy, the level of interest rates, and the credibility of the government's fiscal policies. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. The policymaker must carefully weigh the potential benefits of government intervention against the potential costs of increased debt and distorted markets. Moreover, the composition of government spending is just as important as the level. Investing in education, infrastructure, and research and development can yield long-term economic benefits, while wasteful spending on unproductive projects can be a drag on growth. Likewise, the design of tax policies can have a significant impact on incentives to work, save, and invest. Ultimately, the debate over government debt and deficits is not simply an economic debate. It is a philosophical debate about the role of government in society. It is a debate about individual freedom versus collective responsibility, about short-term stability versus long-term growth. As we move forward, understanding these competing visions is crucial for navigating the complex economic landscape and making informed decisions about the future. But what happens when even these frameworks fail to adequately explain a new era? What novel economic challenges will tomorrow bring? Chapter 42: Technological Disruption and the Future of Work Narrative Landmark. In our previous explorations, we touched upon the cyclical nature of economic progress. Now, we turn our attention to the undercurrents shaping that progress, the enduring debate that echoes through policy chambers and academic halls, competing visions of stabilization and markets. The march of technology, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons, brings with it both promise and peril. While innovation offers the potential for unprecedented prosperity, it also disrupts established industries and reshapes the very nature of work. This disruption, however, isn't a novel phenomenon. Throughout history, technological advancements have prompted questions about economic stability and the role of government. And these questions often lead us back to two distinct schools of thought, embodied in the contrasting visions of the classical economist and the policymaker. Let's consider them not as individuals, but as representatives of fundamental approaches. The classical economist, skeptical of large-scale interventions, views the market as a self-regulating system, a complex ecosystem capable of finding its own equilibrium. In this view, fluctuations, even painful ones, are necessary corrections. Recessions, though undesirable, serve to purge inefficiencies, forcing businesses to adapt and resources to be reallocated. The role of government, according to this perspective, should be limited to maintaining the rule of law, enforcing contracts, and ensuring a stable currency. Excessive intervention, it is argued, distorts market signals, hindering the natural process of adjustment and ultimately leading to greater instability. The policymaker, on the other hand, sees a more active role for government. Faced with the immediate suffering caused by economic downturns, this perspective emphasizes the need for stabilization. During recessions, demand for goods and services often collapses, leading to widespread unemployment and social unrest. The policymaker, drawing on different intellectual currents, believes that government can and should intervene to stimulate demand through fiscal policies such as increased spending or tax cuts, and monetary policies such as lowering interest rates. The goal is to counteract the downward spiral, to provide a safety net for those who have lost their jobs, and to restore confidence in the economy. The tension between these visions lies in their fundamentally different assessments of the market's ability to self-correct. The classical economist emphasizes the long-term efficiency of market forces, even if they involve short-term pain. The policymaker prioritizes the mitigation of immediate suffering and the prevention of deeper crises, even if it means potentially interfering with the market's natural adjustments. Think of it as the difference between allowing a river to carve its own course, even if it floods occasionally, and building dams and levees to control its flow, potentially altering its long-term ecology. Now, consider the impact of technological disruption. As automation and artificial intelligence become more sophisticated, they threaten to displace workers in a wide range of industries. This raises profound questions about the future of work. The classical economists might argue that these disruptions are simply part of the ongoing process of creative destruction, that new industries and occupations will emerge to replace those that are lost. The market, in this view, will eventually adapt, but it may take time and require individuals to acquire new skills. The policymaker, however, might worry about the potential for widespread unemployment and social unrest. This perspective might advocate for policies such as retraining programs, universal basic income, or government investment in new industries to ease the transition. The goal is to ensure that the benefits of technological progress are shared more equitably, and that those who are displaced by automation are not left behind. There is no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. The appropriate response likely lies somewhere in the middle, a delicate balance between allowing market forces to operate and providing a safety net for those who are most vulnerable. Navigating this terrain requires careful consideration of the specific circumstances, a willingness to experiment, and a commitment to learning from both successes and failures. Intellectual drift. This dance between intervention and laissez-faire continues, shaped by each new wave of innovation. The question is not whether to embrace technology, but how to manage its impact, how to ensure that progress benefits all of society. And what of the future? As technology continues to evolve at an accelerating pace, what new economic models will emerge? Will the traditional distinctions between these perspectives blur, or will the debate intensify? What role will community play as markets evolve and become more automated? These are questions that will shape the economic landscape for generations to come. Open loop. As we anticipate the further effects of technological acceleration, the pressing question becomes, what form will the next iteration of the social contract take in an era of pervasive automation? Chapter 43. Contemporary Capitalism. Inequality and Instability. We've seen how the extraction of surplus value, the beating heart of capitalism, fuels its inherent instability. Now, we find ourselves in the modern age, the digital echo of Marx's prophecies ringing in our ears. The rain outside is relentless, mirroring the unyielding pressure on wages, on the lives of ordinary people. Its primary directive, generally, is to maintain price stability and full employment. But how to achieve these goals is where the divergence begins. A schism that echoes the profound disagreements between two towering figures of economic thought, Keynes and Hayek. Section 2. On one side, we have the Keynesian perspective, a belief in the power of active intervention. Imagine the economy as a complex machine prone to sputtering and stalls. The Keynesian, or the policymaker as we'll call them, sees the central bank as a mechanic, ready with tools to fine-tune the engine. When demand falters, leading to unemployment, the policymaker believes in injecting stimulus, lowering interest rates, expanding the money supply, even direct government spending, to jumpstart activity and restore equilibrium. Think of it as adding fuel to a struggling fire, a deliberate effort to rekindle the flames of economic growth. The rationale is clear. Markets are inherently prone to instability and require guidance. Section 3. Contrast this with the Hayekian view, which prizes the inherent wisdom of markets. The Hayekian believes that the economy is more akin to a self-organizing ecosystem, a delicate web of interconnected actors and information. Central bank intervention, in this view, is akin to a clumsy gardener trampling the flower beds in an attempt to improve nature. Manipulating interest rates, for instance, distorts the price signals that guide investment decisions, leading to malinvestment and eventually a painful correction. We can call this figure the classical economist. The classical economist emphasizes that inflation is often the result of excessive money creation by central banks and argues for strict rules to limit their discretionary power. They favor allowing market forces to allocate capital, even if it means enduring short-term pain, believing that this ultimately leads to a more robust and sustainable economy. Think of it as trusting the natural cycles of growth and decay, allowing the system to prune itself and regenerate. Section 4. The tension between these two visions is palpable in every decision made by central banks. During times of crisis, such as the 2008 financial meltdown, the Keynesian impulse to intervene tends to dominate. Central banks flood the market with liquidity, bail out failing institutions, and slash interest rates to near zero. The aim is to prevent a catastrophic collapse of the financial system. However, the classical economist warns that such interventions create moral hazard, encouraging reckless behavior in the future and sowing the seeds of the next crisis. They would argue for allowing the market to cleanse itself, even if it meant a more severe, but ultimately shorter, recession. Section 5. In the years following the 2008 crisis, central banks embarked on unprecedented monetary easing, including quantitative easing, the large-scale purchase of assets to inject liquidity into the financial system. While these measures may have helped to stabilize the economy in the short term, they also raised concerns about inflation, asset bubbles, and the erosion of central bank independence. The classical economist would point to the increased debt burdens and distorted asset prices as evidence of the unintended consequences of intervention. The debate rages on. Are we merely postponing the inevitable correction, or are we successfully managing the inherent instability of capitalism? Section 6. The 21st century central bank is navigating treacherous waters, caught between the Scylla of economic stagnation and the Charybdis of financial instability. It must balance the need for active intervention with the recognition of the limitations of its power. The increasing complexity of the global financial system, the rise of shadow banking, and the proliferation of cryptocurrencies add further layers of complexity to the task. The Keynesian and Hayekian visions provide contrasting maps for navigating this landscape, but neither offers a foolproof solution. The policymaker and the classical economist continue to debate, each with their own set of charts and instruments. Conclusion. As we drift towards the next chapter, consider this. As the world grapples with climate change, growing inequality, and geopolitical uncertainty, what role should central banks play in addressing these challenges? Should they expand their mandates beyond price stability and full employment to encompass broader social and environmental goals? Or would such an expansion lead to mission creep and ultimately undermine their credibility? The economic tides continue to shift, and the answer, like the horizon, remains just beyond our grasp. Perhaps, when we awake, the answer will be clearer. Chapter 44. Climate Change and Economic Policy. A new challenge? Welcome back. Last time we explored the shifting sands of monetary policy in a globalized world. Tonight, we turn our attention to a problem that dwarfs even those complexities: climate change. But rather than dwell on the science, which I trust you're already familiar with, we'll consider it through the lens of competing economic philosophies, specifically the old debate between Keynes and Hayek, and how their visions might inform, or perhaps misinform, our response. This, then, is the crux. How do we adapt the tools of economic stabilization and market design to address a challenge that transcends traditional boom and bust cycles? Let us begin with the familiar terrain. The economic problem, as framed for centuries, has been one of managing fluctuations. Too much demand, we get inflation; too little, recession. The Keynesian response, in its simplest form, is to lean against the wind. When demand falters, the state steps in, spending and investing to fill the void. When the economy overheats, the state pulls back, cooling things down. The goal is a steady, predictable flow, a navigable river of economic activity. Hayek, however, viewed this approach with suspicion. He saw the market as a complex, self-organizing system, a vast network of signals and incentives. Attempts to centrally plan or direct its course, he argued, would inevitably lead to distortions, inefficiencies, and ultimately, to a less prosperous society. The state's role, in Hayek's view, was to maintain a stable legal framework, to ensure the rule of law, and to allow the market to find its own equilibrium. Interventions, even well-intentioned ones, were likely to disrupt the delicate balance of the system. Now, consider climate change. It presents us with a unique kind of instability, not a cyclical upswing or downturn, but a long-term, systemic shift. The question then becomes, which philosophy offers a more compelling framework for addressing this challenge? A purely laissez-faire approach, aligned with Hayek's vision, might argue for relying on market signals. Allow the price of carbon to rise, incentivize innovation in green technologies, and let the market adapt over time. The strength of this approach lies in its reliance on decentralized decision-making and its potential to harness the power of individual initiative. However, the timescale of climate change introduces complications. The effects of our actions today will be felt for decades, even centuries to come. This disconnect between present costs and future benefits creates a strong incentive for inaction, a classic example of what economists call a tragedy of the commons. The market, left to its own devices, may simply be too slow to respond, leading to irreversible damage. This brings us to the Keynesian perspective. A more interventionist approach would involve significant government investment in renewable energy, infrastructure, and research. Carbon taxes, subsidies, and regulations would be used to steer the economy towards a more sustainable path. The rationale here is that the market, left unguided, will fail to account for the long-term social costs of carbon emissions. Yet, even this approach is not without its challenges. Large-scale government interventions can be prone to inefficiencies, corruption, and unintended consequences. There is also the risk of picking winners, investing in technologies that ultimately prove to be unviable. Moreover, a purely top-down approach may stifle innovation and discourage individual initiative. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. A pragmatic approach to climate change might involve a combination of market-based mechanisms and targeted government interventions. A carbon tax, for instance, could provide a clear price signal, incentivizing businesses and individuals to reduce their emissions. At the same time, government investment could accelerate the development of new technologies and build the infrastructure needed to support a transition to a low-carbon economy. The challenge, then, is not simply to choose between Keynes and Hayek, but to synthesize their insights. We need to harness the power of the market while also recognizing its limitations. We need to be both bold and cautious, willing to experiment, but also mindful of the potential for unintended consequences. It is indeed a new challenge, one that demands a careful and nuanced approach. How do we, in the end, properly price risk that manifests on a century-long timescale? This is the puzzle that lies ahead, and one we'll begin to unravel next time. Good night.